This is Sophie Brooks. At just 12 years old, she had already learned that the world had no place for girls like her. She survived more hardship than most people face in a lifetime. Born in Boston to a single mother battling severe depression, Sophie had no father, no stable home, and barely 6 months of formal schooling before everything fell apart. Invisible, forgotten by a system meant to protect her, discarded, yet brilliantly sharp. But one transformative autumn day, everything changed. She met Grace Whitmore, the daughter of a tech billionaire attending the most prestigious academy in Massachusetts, yet drowning in failing grades. And it was Sophie, the homeless girl sleeping in shelters, who became her secret tutor. But when Grace's powerful father, Jonathan Whitmore, discovered a homeless child teaching his daughter behind the school library, what he did next left everyone speechless. So grab your popcorn, settle in, and prepare yourself for one of the most powerful transformation stories you'll ever hear. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button to support more life-changing stories like this one. Let's get back to the story. Move along, kid. You can't stand here. The security guard's command sliced through the October cold like broken glass. Sophie didn't flinch. She'd learned not to. The coffee shop's warmth had been seeping through the window for the past 20 minutes, the only heat she'd felt all morning. But now even that small mercy was being taken away. I said move. This isn't a homeless shelter. Sophie pulled her threadbare jacket tighter and stepped back, her breath forming small desperate clouds in the freezing air. Through the window, she watched people inside sip lattes that cost more than she'd seen in a week. A woman in a cashmere coat laughed at something on her phone. A man in a business suit complained loudly about his coffee being too hot. They never looked up. They never saw her. Her mother, Marilyn, sat slumped against the brick building 10 feet away, staring at nothing. The medication from the free clinic had run out 3 days ago, and Sophie could see her slipping away again, back into that dark place where words became whispers and reality became fog, where mothers forgot they had daughters. "Mommy, we need to go," Sophie whispered, crouching beside her. Marilyn's eyes lifted slowly, passing over Sophie's face without recognition. Just empty. Just hollow. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words meant for ghosts, not children. Sophie reached for her mother's hand, cold, trembling, covered in dirt from sleeping on concrete. "It's me. It's Sophie. You're Sophie." Nothing. Not even a flicker. Sophie had grown used to that look, but it never stopped carving pieces from her heart. 3 years ago, her mother would have pulled her close, kissed her forehead, called her my bright star. Now, Marilyn couldn't even remember having a daughter most days. The shelter wouldn't open for another 2 hours, so they walked. Always walking, always moving. Standing still meant being noticed. Being noticed meant being chased away. Being chased away meant starting over somewhere else, in some other doorway, on some other street where people would pretend not to see them. Sophie guided her mother through the back bay streets, past boutiques with window displays worth more than everything Sophie had ever owned combined. Past restaurants where a single meal cost what they needed to survive for a week. Past people who stepped around them like they were obstacles, not human beings. "Excuse me, did you take my daughter?" Marilyn suddenly shouted at a passing businessman. "I had a daughter once. She had stars in her eyes." The man hurried past without looking, his phone pressed to his ear, his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement. Sophie felt her cheeks burn with shame. She turned and met the eyes of a schoolgirl across the street, neatly dressed in a private school uniform, carrying a designer backpack, holding what looked like a homemade lunch in a real lunchbox. The girl stared for a moment. Then she quickly looked away, whispering something to her friend. They both laughed. Sophie looked down at her own clothes. Jacket with holes in both elbows, jeans stained with things she couldn't identify, sneakers held together with duct tape. Her fingernails were chipped and dirty. Her hair unwashed for days. Her stomach growled so loudly she was certain people 3 blocks away could hear it. Sophie was 12 years old, but the streets had aged her soul to something ancient and tired. She didn't cry anymore when strangers called her names: street rat, dirty kid, waste of space. She'd heard them all, had them burned into her memory like brands. What hurt more was the pity. The empty kind that came with a shake of the head and no hand extended. The kind that said, "I see you're suffering, but it's not my problem." Her mother used to be different. Sophie remembered fragments. A small apartment in Dorchester with yellow curtains that caught the afternoon light just right. Her mother's laugh echoing off kitchen walls, bright and genuine and full of life. Birthday candles on a homemade cake, her mother singing off-key while Sophie made wishes that actually seemed possible back then. "Make a good wish, baby," her mother would say, eyes clear and focused. "Make one that matters." But depression had stolen Marilyn slowly, then suddenly. At first it was just sad days. Days when her mother stayed in bed, curtains drawn, world locked out. Then it was missed shifts at work. Then lost jobs. First one, then another, then another. The bills piled up like snow drifts. Rent went unpaid. Eviction notices appeared on their door in angry red letters, ignored until they couldn't be ignored anymore. Sophie was 9 when men came and changed the locks. She remembered standing on the sidewalk, clutching a garbage bag with her few possessions, watching strangers carry their furniture out to the curb. Her mother had sat on the ground, rocking back and forth, repeating, "This isn't real. This isn't real. Wake up, Marilyn. Wake up." They'd slept in a car that night, a beat-up Honda Civic that barely ran. Her mother's friend had lent it to them, temporarily. Sophie remembered the seats reclined as far as they'd go, her mother's arm around her, the smell of old fast food in desperation. "It's just for a little while," her mother had promised. "Just until I get back on my feet, baby. I promise." That promise lasted 6 months before the car was repossessed. Sophie was 10 by then. She'd learned to sleep sitting up, to wash in public bathroom sinks, to stretch one meal into 2 days. They'd been inside the public library that morning trying to stay warm, when they came back to find the parking spot empty. Just gone. Like it had never existed. Sophie had been 11 for 3 months when she realized with crushing, absolute clarity, nobody was coming to save them. They had no father. Not even a name, not even a photograph. "Who's my daddy?" Sophie had asked once, years ago, when she still believed questions deserved answers. Marilyn had looked at her with those same hollow eyes that had already started appearing back then and said, "I don't remember, baby. Maybe he was a dream. Maybe I dreamed all of this." That was the end of that conversation. The end of the fantasy that somewhere out there, a father existed who might want to know her, who might come rescue them from this nightmare. But Sophie had something the streets couldn't take away, her mind. She remembered everything. Every single thing she'd ever learned in those 6 precious months of formal schooling before the money ran out and the doors closed. She could still recite the multiplication tables her second-grade teacher had written on the board. Could still diagram sentences the way Mrs. Rodriguez had taught her. Could still recall the exact words of every book she'd read during those brief, beautiful months when she'd been a regular kid in a regular classroom. And she'd taught herself more. So much more. She learned by pressing her face against bookstore windows in Harvard Square, memorizing pages before staff came out and shooed her away. She'd stand there for hours, absorbing words like her life depended on it. Because maybe in some way it did. Maybe keeping her mind sharp was the only thing preventing her from disappearing completely into the gray fog of survival. She solved math problems in her head while standing in food bank lines. Algebra, geometry, even trigonometry she'd overheard from a college student's tutoring session in the library. The numbers made sense to her in ways that life never did. They had rules. They had answers. They were reliable. She memorized historical dates from discarded newspapers. Taught herself French from a water-damaged textbook she'd found in a dumpster behind a school. Learned about photosynthesis and cellular biology from a National Geographic someone had left on a park bench. It was extraordinary. She was extraordinary. Though no one knew it. How could they? All they saw was the dirt, the torn clothes, the homeless girl they stepped around on their way to somewhere important. The painful contrast haunted her. She had a mind that could compete with students at the best schools in Boston, locked inside a body that smelled like shelter soap and wore Salvation Army cast-offs. She could solve complex equations while standing in donated shoes held together with duct tape. Could analyze Shakespeare while her stomach cramped from hunger. could remember every capital city in the world while sleeping on cardboard. It was like being a prisoner in her own life. She had the key to escape, her intelligence, but no door it would fit. Sophie? The voice was so quiet Sophie almost missed it. She turned to see her mother looking at her, really looking at her, for the first time in days. Marilyn's eyes were clearer now, focused. One of those rare, precious moments of lucidity that Sophie had learned not to take for granted. "Mommy?" Sophie's voice cracked. "You're here?" "My bright star," Marilyn whispered, reaching up to touch Sophie's cheek with trembling fingers. "My brilliant, beautiful bright star. I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Sophie grabbed her mother's hand and held it tight, like she could anchor her to reality through sheer force of will. "It's okay, Mommy. It's okay. I'm here. I've got you. You deserve so much more than this." Marilyn's eyes filled with tears. "You deserve a real home, a real school, a real life. Not this." "We're going to be okay," Sophie lied, the words automatic now. "We're going to figure it out." But even as she said it, Marilyn's eyes were already starting to cloud over again. The lucidity lasted maybe 2 minutes, a shooting star of clarity in an endless dark sky. Then her mother's expression went blank again, her hand going limp in Sophie's grip. "The birds are singing backwards," Marilyn muttered, turning away. "Do you hear them? Backwards, backwards, backwards." And just like that, she was gone again. Sophie swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. She wouldn't cry. Crying didn't help. Crying didn't change anything. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. By late afternoon, Sophie found herself near Commonwealth Avenue, watching students stream out of a private school. They moved in clusters, laughing, complaining about homework, making plans for the weekend. Their backpacks looked heavy with books Sophie would treasure. Their uniforms were crisp and clean. Their biggest worry seemed to be what their parents were making for dinner. Sophie stood behind the iron fence, fingers wrapped around the cold metal bars, watching like she was observing another species. These kids lived in a different world. A world of stability and certainty, of adults who remembered their children's names, of homes that didn't disappear when the rent went unpaid. A world where intelligence was nurtured, not buried under the daily struggle to survive. "One day," Sophie whispered to herself, the words forming small clouds in the cold air. "One day I'll sit in a real classroom. One day someone will see me. One day this won't be my whole life." It was the same promise she made herself every day. The same impossible dream that kept her walking when everything hurt, that kept her learning when learning seemed pointless, that kept her hoping when hope was the most dangerous thing she could hold on to. She had no idea that one day was closer than she thought. She had no idea that just a few blocks away, behind another school's library, there was a cracked window where she'd soon crouch in the bushes, absorbing lessons like her mind was starving for them. She had no idea that a billionaire named Jonathan Whitmore would soon look at her, really look at her, and see not a homeless girl to be pitied or avoided, but a human being worth fighting for. All Sophie knew in that moment, watching those privileged students disappear into their privileged lives, was that she refused to give up. Refused to let the streets take her mind the way depression had taken her mother. Refused to become invisible, even though the world was doing everything it could to make her disappear. "Come on, Mommy," Sophie said softly, turning away from the fence. "Let's go find somewhere warm." Marilyn stood without protest, following Sophie like a shadow as they walked into the gathering dusk. Two figures moving through the Boston streets, seen by everyone, noticed by no one. But that was about to change. Everything was about to change. All Sophie knew in that moment, watching those privileged students disappear into their privileged lives, was that she refused to give up. Refused to let the streets take her mind the way depression had taken her mother. Refused to become invisible, even though the world was doing everything it could to make her disappear. "Come on, Mommy," Sophie said softly, turning away from the fence. "Let's go find somewhere warm." Marilyn stood without protest, following Sophie like a shadow as they walked into the gathering dusk. Two figures moving through the Boston streets, seen by everyone, noticed by no one. But that was about to change. Everything was about to change. The soup kitchen near Copley Square didn't look like much from the outside. Just a basement entrance beneath the old brownstone church, a hand-painted sign that read Grace's Table swinging in the October wind. But to Sophie it was a lifeline. They served dinner 3 nights a week, and if you got there early enough, the food was still hot and there was usually enough for seconds. More importantly, it was warm. And they let you stay for an hour after eating, no questions asked. Sophie guided her mother down the concrete steps on a Thursday evening, joining the line of people who looked just like them, tired, worn, invisible. The smell of vegetable soup drifted up from below, making Sophie's stomach clench with anticipation. They hadn't eaten since yesterday's breakfast at the shelter. Inside, the basement was crowded but organized. Long folding tables lined the walls, mismatched chairs filled with people hunched over bowls. At the front, volunteers served food from large steel pots, their faces kind but professionally distant. Most of them didn't make eye contact. They served the food, offered a tight smile, and moved on to the next person. But there was one woman who was different. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson stood at the corner table, not serving food but organizing donated books and magazines into neat piles. She was perhaps 70, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. She wore a cardigan despite the basement's warmth and sensible shoes that had seen better days. Sophie noticed her because Mrs. Patterson was doing something unusual. She was watching people. Really watching them. Not with pity or judgment, but with genuine curiosity, like she was reading stories written in their faces. After getting their food, soup and half a sandwich each, Sophie settled her mother at a corner table and went to grab a discarded newspaper someone had left behind. It was 3 days old, but Sophie didn't care. News was news. Words were words. And reading kept her mind sharp. She sat beside her mother, who was mechanically eating her soup with vacant eyes, and opened the paper to the crossword puzzle. Someone had started it but given up after filling in only a few answers. Sophie studied it for a moment, then began solving it in her head. 12 across, 7 letters, Shakespearean prince consumed by indecision. Hamlet, Sophie thought. Obviously. 23 down, 9 letters. Scientific theory explaining species adaptation. Evolution. Too easy. She was mentally working through the more difficult clues when a voice interrupted her thoughts. You're bright. Very bright. Sophie looked up sharply. Mrs. Patterson stood beside her table, holding a stack of books, her eyes fixed on Sophie with an expression Sophie couldn't quite read. Sophie's defenses went up immediately. She'd learned that compliments from strangers usually came with strings attached. You're so smart. Can you watch my bag while I use the bathroom? Or you seem capable, help me carry these groceries. And then they'd disappear without the promised payment or the offered meal. I'm just reading, Sophie said carefully, closing the newspaper. You were solving that crossword puzzle. In your head. Mrs. Patterson gestured to the paper. I've been watching you for the past 10 minutes. You haven't written anything down, but your eyes are moving through the clues systematically. Top to bottom, left to right. Sophie said nothing. Confirmation felt dangerous. How old are you? Mrs. Patterson asked gently. 12. And you come here with your mother? Sophie nodded, glancing at Marilyn, who was now staring at her empty bowl like it held secrets. Mrs. Patterson pulled out a chair and sat down without asking permission. My name is Eleanor Patterson. I'm a retired librarian. Used to work at the main branch downtown for 37 years before I retired. Now I volunteer here 3 nights a week. She paused. What's your name? Sophie. Sophie Brooks. Well, Sophie Brooks, I think you're a very interesting young lady. Mrs. Patterson smiled, but it wasn't the pitying smile Sophie was used to. It was respectful. Would you mind if I brought you something next week? Sophie's guard went higher. Brought me what? A book. Your choice. Any subject you want. Why? Because you're bright, Mrs. Patterson repeated. Very bright. And bright minds should be fed. She stood, collected her books, and walked away before Sophie could respond. The next week, Mrs. Patterson was there again. And the week after that. She never pushed, never demanded Sophie's time or attention. She'd simply place a book on Sophie's usual table, sometimes a novel, sometimes non-fiction, once a college-level mathematics textbook that made Sophie's heart race with excitement, and then move on to her other tasks. Sophie devoured every single one. After 3 weeks, Mrs. Patterson started leaving paper and pencils along with the books. Good quality ones, not the cheap kind that broke after 2 uses. Sophie would sit for hours after eating, reading and taking notes in careful, precise handwriting, while her mother hummed tunelessly beside her. "You write beautifully," Mrs. Patterson commented one evening, glancing over Sophie's shoulder at a page filled with notes about cellular biology. "Very organized. Very thorough." "I like to remember things," Sophie said quietly. "How much schooling have you had?" The question Sophie had been dreading. 6 months. 2nd grade. Before we... She gestured vaguely, unable to finish the sentence. Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted, not to pity, but to something that looked like anger on Sophie's behalf. 6 months. And you're reading at this level? I teach myself. Libraries. Bookstores. Anywhere I can find words. Sophie, look at me. Sophie raised her eyes reluctantly. Do you understand what you have? This gift you have. Sophie shrugged. What good was a gift she couldn't use? Everything I've read I remember, Sophie admitted. Every word. Every equation. Every fact. I don't know why. I just do. Mrs. Patterson sat down heavily, like the weight of this revelation had physical mass. Everything? Sophie, that's not normal. That's not even just bright. That's extraordinary. That's... She stopped thinking. That's something we need to do something about. There's nothing to do, Sophie said flatly. I'm homeless. Nobody cares about homeless kids. We're invisible. You're not invisible to me. And Sophie realized with a shock that made her chest tight, that it was true. Mrs. Patterson saw her. Actually saw her. Not the dirt or the torn clothes or the homeless label. But her. Sophie. The girl who loved learning more than eating. The girl who solved crossword puzzles in her head. The girl who refused to let circumstance define her worth. What if, Mrs. Patterson said slowly, I could get you into a tutoring program? Just for a few months. Real teachers. Real structure. Would you want that? Sophie's breath caught. We don't have money. I know someone. They offer scholarships for students in difficult situations. Let me make some calls. Why? Sophie whispered. Why would you do that for me? Mrs. Patterson reached across the table and gently covered Sophie's hand with her own. Because 37 years as a librarian taught me that the most important books are the ones people overlook. And Sophie Brooks, you're a story that deserves to be read. 3 weeks later, Sophie walked into the Boston Community Learning Center with donated clothes that actually fit, a backpack filled with new supplies, and hope burning so bright in her chest it hurt. Mrs. Patterson had paid for 3 months in advance. A gift, she'd said firmly when Sophie tried to protest. From someone who believes in you. The tutoring center was nothing fancy, just 3 rooms above a community center in Roxbury, staffed by retired teachers and college students earning service credits. But to Sophie it was heaven. Her first day they gave her a placement test to see where she'd fit. The director, a patient woman named Miss Chin, handed Sophie a pencil and said, just do your best. No pressure. Sophie finished the 8th grade math assessment in 12 minutes. The 10th grade English comprehension in 15. The high school history exam in 20. Miss Chin stared at the completed tests like Sophie had performed a magic trick. How? She started, then stopped. Sophie, you're testing at high school level. Almost college level in some areas. How is that possible with only 6 months of formal schooling? Sophie shrugged, embarrassed. I read a lot. You don't just read a lot, Miss Chin said softly. You have a photographic memory, don't you? An eidetic memory? Sophie had never heard the term before, but the description fit. I guess so. Over the next 2 months, Sophie bloomed like a plant finally given sunlight. She absorbed lessons with a hunger that amazed her tutors. She asked questions that challenged them. She solved problems in ways they'd never seen before. She's extraordinary, she heard one tutor tell Miss Chen. This child could be anything. Anything at all. For the first time in years, Sophie let herself dream beyond survival. Maybe she could go to college. Maybe she could become a scientist or a teacher or a writer. Maybe being homeless didn't have to be forever. Even her mother had better days during this period. The stability of having a routine, even just the routine of Sophie leaving for tutoring 3 afternoons a week, seemed to calm something in Marilyn. She had more lucid moments. She called Sophie Bright Star more often. Sophie started to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were turning around. She should have known better. Mrs. Patterson didn't come to the soup kitchen the first week of December. Or the second week. By the third week, Sophie was worried enough to ask one of the other volunteers. "Oh, honey," the woman said, her face falling. "Mrs. Patterson's husband had a stroke. A bad one. She's been at the hospital round the clock." Sophie felt her stomach drop. "Is he okay?" "They don't know yet. It's not looking good." 2 weeks later, Mrs. Patterson finally appeared. But she looked like she'd aged 10 years. Her hair was disheveled. Her cardigan had a stain. Her eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. "Sophie," she said, and Sophie heard everything in that one word. They sat at their usual table. Mrs. Patterson's hands trembled as she clasped them together. "My husband is in long-term care now. He can't come home. The medical bills are..." She stopped, swallowed hard. "We're refinancing the house. Liquidating our retirement savings. It's all going to medical care." "I'm so sorry," Sophie whispered. "Sophie, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Mrs. Patterson's voice cracked. "I can't keep paying for the tutoring center. I can barely keep the soup kitchen running. I have to close it. I have to focus on my husband. I have to..." She broke off, tears streaming down her face. Sophie felt her own eyes burning, but she blinked the tears back. "It's okay. You've already done so much. More than anyone ever." "It's not okay." Mrs. Patterson grabbed Sophie's hands. "You're brilliant. You deserve so much more than this. You deserve a real education. A real chance. And I'm abandoning you just like everyone else." "You're not abandoning me," Sophie said firmly, even as her heart shattered into pieces. "You saw me. You believed in me. Nobody else did that. Nobody. It's not enough. It's everything." They sat there, two people carrying impossible burdens, crying quietly while the soup kitchen bustled around them. The next week, Grace's table was closed. A sign on the door read, "Temporarily suspended due to family emergency." Sophie stood outside that basement entrance, her hand flat against the door, whispering to the darkness below. "Thank you for seeing me, Mrs. Patterson. Thank you for believing I was worth something." The tutoring center called 3 days later to say her scholarship had expired. No new funding available. She could reapply next year if her circumstances changed. Sophie's mother got worse without the stability. Without the routine of the soup kitchen. Without Sophie's regular tutoring schedule, Marilyn slipped deeper into her fog. She stopped speaking in complete sentences. She stopped recognizing Sophie at all. And Sophie was alone again. But this time, the isolation cut deeper because now she knew exactly what she was missing. She'd tasted education, tasted possibility, tasted hope. Mrs. Patterson had shown her she was capable of extraordinary things. And then the door had slammed shut again. But as Sophie walked through the cold December streets, her mother shuffling beside her, she made herself a promise. "I won't forget," she whispered to the wind. "I won't forget what you taught me, that I'm worth something. That my mind is a gift, not a curse. That being homeless doesn't mean being hopeless." She had no idea that in less than 2 months, she'd find herself behind another school, crouching by another window, teaching herself again. She had no idea that this time someone would be listening. Someone who needed her just as much as she needed to be needed. Sophie had never meant to find Whitmore Academy. She'd been wandering through Beacon Hill on a bitter January morning, looking for places that might offer warmth without requiring payment or permission. The public library didn't open until 10. The train station was cracking down on loiterers. The coffee shops chased her away before she could absorb more than 5 minutes of heat. So she walked, her mother trailing behind her like a ghost, through streets lined with historic brownstones and gas lamps that belonged in a different century. This was old money Boston, the kind of neighborhood where people paid more for parking spaces than Sophie's mother had earned in a year back when she could still work. She turned a corner and stopped dead. The building rose before her like something from a dream, or a movie about people whose lives bore no resemblance to hers. Whitmore Academy. 3 stories of gleaming glass and red brick, surrounded by manicured grounds that probably required a full-time gardening staff. A wrought iron fence enclosed the property, topped with decorative spikes that were clearly more about aesthetics than security. Students walked through the main gate in clusters, their uniforms crisp and identical. Navy blazers with gold trim, white shirts, plaid skirts, or pressed khakis. Every single one of them carried a leather backpack that probably cost more than Sophie had seen in 6 months. Sophie looked down at her own feet. Sneakers with holes in both toes, held together with duct tape that had long since lost its stickiness. Jeans so stained she couldn't remember their original color. A jacket 3 sizes too big that she'd found in a donation bin, one sleeve torn at the shoulder. The contrast was so stark it was almost funny. Almost. Above the main gate, a golden emblem caught the morning light, a book surrounded by laurel leaves with words inscribed beneath in elegant script, "Excellence through knowledge." Sophie felt something twist in her chest. Excellence. Knowledge. 2 things she craved more than food or shelter or warmth. 2 things that existed just beyond this fence, so close she could almost touch them, yet impossibly far away. "Come on, Mommy," she whispered, tugging her mother's sleeve. "We should go." But as they walked along the fence line, Sophie couldn't help looking back. Couldn't help watching those students disappear through doors she'd never be allowed to enter. Couldn't help wondering what it felt like to take education for granted, to complain about homework instead of dreaming about it. That's when she noticed the window. The east wing of the building jutted out slightly from the main structure, probably added in a later renovation. Behind it, away from the main grounds, was a small service area. Dumpsters, HVAC units, a storage shed. And a window. Just one, probably belonging to a classroom on the back side of the building. It was cracked open. Maybe an inch. Enough for air to circulate. Enough for sound to travel. Sophie glanced around. No one was watching this side of the building. Everyone used the main entrance. This area was clearly meant to be invisible, the functional, unglamorous part of the academy that students never saw. Perfect. She settled her mother on a bench near the bus stop a block away, made sure she had the granola bar they'd gotten from the shelter that morning, and whispered, "Stay here, Mommy. I'll be right back." "Okay. Right back." Marilyn didn't respond. She was having one of her faraway days, staring at something only she could see. Sophie hurried back to the academy, slipped behind the storage shed, and crouched beneath the window. She could hear voices. A teacher's voice, clear and authoritative, echoing through the crack in the window. "Now let's review the fundamental theorem of calculus. Who can tell me how we evaluate the definite integral of a continuous function?" Calculus. Sophie's heart raced. She'd taught herself basic calculus from that college textbook Mrs. Patterson had given her, but she'd never heard it taught properly, never heard the explanations and discussions that made concepts click into place. She pressed herself against the brick wall and listened. For the next hour she absorbed everything. The teacher's explanations. The students' questions. The examples worked out on the board that Sophie could visualize in her mind. She solved the problems along with them, faster than them if she was being honest, her mind working through derivatives and integrals with the ease of someone who'd been starving for exactly this kind of intellectual challenge. When the bell rang and the class emptied out, Sophie stayed frozen in place, her mind replaying everything she'd heard, committing it to memory. The addiction had begun. By the end of the first week, Sophie had the routine down to a science. Morning, get to the day shelter when it opened at 7. Make sure her mother had breakfast, usually oatmeal and weak coffee. Get Marilyn settled in the common room where she could sit safely, supervised by staff until Sophie returned. 8 a.m. Position herself behind the east wing window. The first class was usually AP Calculus, followed by American Literature, then World History, then Chemistry. She'd learned the schedule by listening, had it memorized like she memorized everything else. She'd crouch in her spot, back against the brick wall, sometimes sitting on a flattened cardboard box she'd hidden behind the shed. Her hands would be shoved in her pockets for warmth, her breath forming small clouds in the January cold. But she barely noticed the temperature once the lesson started. 3 p.m. Classes ended. Sophie would hurry back to the day shelter, check on her mother, then spend the afternoon finding food, dumpster diving behind grocery stores, waiting in line at the food bank, occasionally panhandling when desperation overrode shame. Evening. This was Sophie's favorite time. After her mother fell asleep in whatever shelter they'd managed to get into that night, Sophie would replay the day's lessons in her mind. She'd work through problems, memorize vocabulary, trace chemical formulas in the margins of newspapers with a pencil stub she'd found. She had no textbooks, no computer, no supplies beyond scraps of paper and that one pencil. But her mind was a vault, and she was filling it with everything Whitmore Academy had to offer. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She was probably getting a better education than some of the students actually enrolled at the academy, the ones who slept through lectures or scrolled through their phones instead of paying attention. She absorbed every word, every concept, every detail like her life depended on it. Because maybe in some way it did. She'd had a few close calls. The groundskeeper had almost discovered her spot one morning. Sophie had heard his footsteps, the jingle of keys on his belt, and had pressed herself flat against the wall, hardly breathing as he walked past not 3 feet away. He'd been muttering about the weather, completely oblivious to the girl frozen in terror behind the shed. Another time, a security patrol had passed through, 2 guards making their rounds, checking doors and windows. Sophie had scrambled into the bushes, thorns scratching her arms, her heart pounding so hard she was certain they'd hear it. They'd walked right past her hiding spot, complaining about the cold, never noticing the homeless girl holding her breath 6 feet away. After that, Sophie learned their schedule. Guards came through at 7:45 a.m., 12:30 p.m., and 3:15 p.m. She adjusted her timing accordingly, always arriving after the morning check, always leaving before the afternoon one. She became a ghost. Invisible. There but not there. Exactly what she'd always been. Watching the students through the window was sometimes harder than the cold or the hunger. One morning she heard a boy complain, "This is so boring. Why do we even need to know this stuff?" He tossed his textbook onto his desk with a thud that made Sophie flinch. That textbook, pristine, expensive, filled with knowledge, treated like garbage because learning felt like a chore instead of a gift. I would treasure that book, Sophie thought, anger flaring hot in her chest. I would sleep with it under my pillow. I would read it until the pages fell out. And you throw it aside like it's nothing. Another day, she watched a girl spend an entire history lecture staring at her phone, texting, completely ignoring the teacher's passionate explanation of the civil rights movement. The teacher's voice shook with emotion as she described the freedom riders, the sit-ins, the courage it took to fight for equality. Sophie hung on every word, committing names and dates and stories to memory. The girl with the phone didn't look up once. The wealth gap had never been more apparent. These students had everything, resources, support, opportunity, and many of them treated it with casual indifference. Sophie had nothing and would have given anything for just 1 hour inside that classroom. 1 hour with actual books and teachers and the chance to ask questions. But the fence between them might as well have been a brick wall. They existed in different worlds, and that fence made sure those worlds never touched. Except they were about to. It was a late October afternoon when everything changed. Sophie was in her usual spot, listening to an English class discuss Romeo and Juliet. The teacher was asking about tragic flaws, and Sophie was mentally composing her own answer. Romeo's impulsivity, his tendency to act on emotion rather than reason, his inability to pause and think before making irreversible choices. When she heard the library's back door open, she froze. Students never came out this way. This was the service entrance, the invisible door that led to the part of the building no one was supposed to see. But someone was coming out now. A girl. About Sophie's age, maybe a bit younger. Long dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Whitmore uniform perfectly pressed. And tears streaming down her face. Sophie pressed herself flatter against the wall, praying the girl wouldn't look her direction. But the girl wasn't looking anywhere except at the math textbook clutched in her hands. She sat down right there on the concrete steps, her back against the brick wall, and muttered to herself, "I'm so stupid. I'm so stupid. I'll never get this." Sophie risked a glance. The girl had opened the textbook to a page filled with equations. Algebra. Quadratic equations from the look of it. Sophie recognized them immediately. She'd taught herself quadratic equations years ago from that water-damaged textbook she'd found in a dumpster. She could solve them in her sleep. The girl stared at the page, fresh tears falling onto the paper. Why can't I understand this? Everyone else gets it. Why am I so dumb? Sophie's chest tightened. She knew that feeling, the frustration of struggling with something everyone else seemed to find easy. Except in Sophie's case, it had been survival, not math. And this girl clearly wasn't dumb. She was just stuck, looking at the problem wrong, making it harder than it needed to be. Stay hidden, Sophie told herself. This isn't your business. You'll get caught. You'll get in trouble. She thought of Mrs. Patterson's words. Sometimes being invisible is the safest thing. But then the girl whispered, I wish someone could just explain it in a way that makes sense. And Sophie heard the desperation in her voice. The same desperation Sophie had felt 1,000 times, wishing someone would help, wishing someone would see her struggle and care enough to intervene. Sophie looked at the equation the girl was staring at. It was written wrong. That was the problem. The girl had set it up backwards, put the variable on the wrong side, and now the whole solution path was tangled. You're doing the equation backwards, Sophie thought. And then, before her brain could stop her mouth, she whispered it out loud. You're doing the equation backwards. The girl's head snapped up. Who's there? Sophie's heart stopped. She'd revealed herself. Broken her own cardinal rule. She should run. Right now. Disappear before. Hello? Who said that? The girl stood, looking around, her eyes searching the shadows behind the building. Sophie had a choice. Run or emerge. Hide or help. She thought about Mrs. Patterson seeing her when no one else did. She thought about how that single act of recognition had changed her life, even temporarily. She thought about this girl, crying over a math problem Sophie could solve in seconds, and how desperately people needed to be seen, to be helped, to be reminded they weren't stupid or worthless or alone. Slowly, very slowly, Sophie stood up. Hands raised like she was surrendering. Like she was harmless. Which she was. Just a homeless girl who happened to know algebra. She stepped into view. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Grace saw a girl who looked like she'd stepped out of a nightmare. Clothes that hung off a too thin frame, dirt smudged across hollow cheeks, eyes that were simultaneously ancient and terrified. Her hair was tangled, her hands chapped and red from cold, her sneakers literally falling apart. Sophie saw a girl who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Perfect uniform, perfect hair, perfect skin that had never known hunger or cold or the particular shame of having strangers spit at your feet. I didn't mean to scare you, Sophie said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. You're not stupid. You're really not. Who are you? Grace interrupted, standing up. Do you go here? Sophie's hands were still raised, like she expected Grace to call security any second. No. I listened through the window. She swallowed hard. I'm homeless. Grace blinked. Of all the things she'd expected to hear, that wasn't one of them. You listened through the window? Behind the building. There's a crack. I can hear the classes. I've been coming here for weeks. Sophie took a step back. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything. I'll go. I won't come back. I promise Wait. Grace looked down at her textbook, then back at Sophie. You said I'm doing the equation backwards? Sophie nodded slowly. Show me. What? Grace sat back down on the steps and patted the concrete beside her. Show me what I'm doing wrong. Sophie hesitated. This felt like a trap. Rich girls didn't just sit down with homeless kids and ask them for help. Rich girls called security. Rich girls laughed and whispered to their friends. Rich girls. Please? Grace said, and there was something in her voice, desperation maybe, or hope, That sounded exactly like Sophie felt most days. Sophie moved forward carefully, like approaching a wild animal that might bolt. She lowered herself onto the step, keeping a respectful distance between them. Grace slid the textbook across the concrete, and Sophie picked it up with hands that trembled slightly. She hadn't held a real textbook, a new one that didn't smell like mildew or have pages falling out, in months. The weight of it felt sacred. "Okay," Sophie said quietly, studying the problem. "See, you're setting up the equation correctly, but then you're trying to isolate x on the wrong side. You need to move the constant first before you deal with the coefficient." She pointed to the page, her finger tracing the steps. "If you have 2x plus 5 is equal to 13, you don't multiply both sides first. You subtract 5 from both sides. Then you divide by 2. Does that make sense?" Grace stared at the page, her brow furrowed. Then, slowly, her expression changed. Oh my God, that actually makes sense." She grabbed a pencil from her backpack and started working through the problem again, this time following Sophie's logic. When she reached the answer, x equals 4, she looked up with eyes so bright they could have powered the building. "I got it. I actually got it." Then her smile faded slightly. "How did you learn this?" "I listen," Sophie said simply. "I hear the teachers through the window. And I remember. Everything. Every word." "Everything?" Sophie nodded. Grace set down her pencil and really looked at Sophie for the first time. Not at the dirt or the torn clothes, but at the person underneath. "How old are you?" 12. "Me too. Well, almost 13. My birthday's next month." Grace paused. "What's your name?" "Sophie. Sophie Brooks." "I'm Grace. Grace Whitmore." She hesitated, then added, "Everyone thinks I'm dumb, you know. I've had private tutors since I was 8. The best ones money can buy. But nothing helps. I still fail every math test. Still get CS in everything except art." Sophie heard the pain in Grace's voice, the same pain she'd heard when Grace was crying over the textbook. "You're not dumb. Sometimes people just explain things wrong. Or in a way that doesn't work for how your brain processes information. My dad thinks I'm not trying hard enough." "Your dad's wrong." Grace laughed, a short, surprised sound. "You don't even know my dad. I know you're sitting here crying over homework on a Tuesday afternoon instead of hanging out with friends. That's trying." Sophie paused. Sometimes the smartest people struggle in school because school wasn't designed for how they think. Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, "Will you come back tomorrow?" Sophie's breath caught. "What? Can you teach me more? Please? You explained that in 2 minutes better than my tutor has in 2 months. Sophie's mind raced. This was dangerous. If she got caught on school property, if someone found out she'd been hiding here for weeks, listening through windows, talking to students. But Grace was looking at her with the same desperate hope Sophie had felt when Mrs. Patterson first offered to help. How could she say no to someone who looked like she was drowning? "Same time, same place," Sophie whispered. "But you can't tell anyone. No one can know I'm here." "Why not?" "Because people like me aren't supposed to be here. If anyone finds out." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Grace nodded slowly. "Okay. Just us. Nobody else. Just us." They met every day for 2 weeks. Behind the library, hidden from view, Sophie taught and Grace learned. Math first because that was Grace's biggest struggle. But then literature, when Grace confessed she didn't understand the symbolism in the novel they were reading. Then history, when Grace couldn't remember the causes of World War I. Then science, when Grace stared blankly at chemical equations. Sophie explained everything clearly, patiently, breaking down complex concepts into pieces Grace could understand and remember. She didn't talk down to Grace or make her feel stupid. She just helped. And Grace shared her lunch. The first time she pulled out a sandwich and offered half to Sophie, Sophie's pride almost made her refuse. But her stomach was louder than her pride, and Grace's expression was so earnest, so lacking in pity, that Sophie found herself accepting. She tried not to eat too quickly. Tried to savor every bite of the turkey sandwich on fresh bread with real lettuce and tomatoes. Tried not to think about how this was the best thing she'd eaten in weeks. My housekeeper makes too much anyway, Grace said casually, like sharing food with a homeless girl was the most normal thing in the world. She's always trying to get me to eat more. Their conversations deepened beyond academics. Grace asked about Sophie's life, and Sophie shared a carefully edited version. Her mother's illness, the shelters, the difficulty of staying warm. But not the worst parts. Not the spit landing near her feet or the way people looked through her like she was invisible or the nights when she wondered if surviving was worth the effort. Grace shared her own loneliness. Everyone at school is fake, she admitted one afternoon. They're my friends because of my dad's money. Because being friends with a Whitmore looks good. But they don't actually like me. They laugh at me behind my back when I mess up in class. I'm your friend because of who you are, Sophie said quietly. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Nobody's ever said that to me before. Well, it's true. You're kind. You're trying. And you're not dumb, no matter what anyone says. Grace wiped her eyes quickly. You're the first person who's ever made me believe that. Over those 2 weeks, something remarkable happened. Grace's grades began to improve. Not dramatically, Sophie wasn't working miracles. But steadily, noticeably. Grace answered a question correctly in math class, and the teacher did a double take. She volunteered an answer in history and her classmates turned to stare. She wrote an essay analyzing symbolism in literature that earned a B+, and the teacher wrote in red ink, "Excellent improvement. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." Grace's posture changed. She sat straighter in class, raised her hand more often, spoke with more confidence. The girl who'd been crying over a math textbook 3 weeks ago now walked through the halls with her head up. "Miss Whitmore, I'm impressed with your progress," Sophie overheard a teacher say through the window one day. "Your father will be very pleased." Sophie, crouched in her hiding spot, felt a warm glow in her chest. She'd done that. Her teaching had helped someone. But Grace wanted to tell people. Wanted to give Sophie credit. "I should tell them about you," Grace said one afternoon. "Tell them I have a tutor who actually explains things in a way I understand." "No." Sophie's response was immediate and sharp. "No one can know. Grace, please. People like me aren't supposed to be here. If they find out I've been hiding on school property, listening through windows, they'll..." She swallowed hard. "They'll make sure I can never come back. And maybe worse." Grace's frustration was visible. "But that's not fair. You should be in school. You should. Should doesn't matter. This is reality." Sophie's voice was gentle but firm. "Just us. Nobody else. That's the only way this works." Grace finally nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Okay. Our secret. Our secret." Sophie was late one Tuesday afternoon. She arrived breathless, her eyes red, her hands shaking. Grace stood immediately. "What's wrong?" Sophie tried to smile. Failed. "Nothing. I'm fine. Should we work on that chemistry assignment?" "Sophie. What happened?" And Sophie broke. "My mom, yesterday she tried to walk into traffic. Just stepped off the curb right in front of a bus. I grabbed her jacket and pulled her back, but..." Sophie's voice cracked. "She doesn't remember who I am anymore, Grace. She looks at me like I'm a stranger. This morning she asked me why I kept following her. Her own daughter, and she thinks I'm some random kid stalking her." Grace pulled Sophie into a hug and Sophie, who'd spent years building walls to protect herself, collapsed into it. She sobbed into Grace's perfect uniform blazer, leaving dirt stains and tears, while Grace held her and whispered, "It's okay. I've got you. You're not alone." When Sophie finally pulled away, embarrassed and wiping her face with her sleeve, Grace said, "There has to be something we can do. For your mom. There has to be help available." Sophie laughed bitterly. "For people like us? Grace, the free clinic runs out of medication. The shelters are always full. Social services have a 6-month wait list for mental health evaluations. People like us don't get help. We just survive. Day by day. That's it." "That's not right." "No," Sophie agreed quietly. "It's not. But it's reality." Grace's jaw set in a way Sophie hadn't seen before. Determination. Anger on Sophie's behalf. "Well, reality sucks." Despite everything, Sophie smiled. Yeah. Yeah, it really does. Their time was almost up for the day. Sophie needed to get back to the shelter before they closed intake. Grace had to get home before her father started asking questions about where she'd been. Same time tomorrow? Grace asked. Same time tomorrow. Sophie slipped through the gap in the fence, that same gap she'd been using for weeks. Before disappearing completely, she turned back and waved. Grace waved back, both of them smiling, two girls from impossible different worlds who'd somehow found each other. Neither of them noticed the black Tesla pulling into the main parking lot. Neither of them knew that Jonathan Whitmore had decided to surprise his daughter with an unexpected visit. Neither of them realized that their secret was about to become very, very public. Grace watched Sophie disappear around the corner, then whispered to herself, "That's not right. That's not fair. Someone should help her." But she had no idea that someone would. Or that the person who would help was closer than she thought. Jonathan Whitmore stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 45th floor, overlooking Boston Harbor. At 45, he cut an impressive figure, 6'2", graying at the temples in a way that suggested wisdom rather than age, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His presence filled the room even when he wasn't speaking, a commanding energy that made junior executives straighten their spines and investors lean forward with interest. Right now, he was juggling 3 phone calls simultaneously. "Tell the Tokyo office we're moving forward with the expansion," he said into his headset, while typing rapid-fire notes on his laptop. His assistant, Marcus, hovered nearby with a tablet, silently flagging urgent messages. "Yes, I understand the concerns about market saturation, but our projections show." He switched to the second call with a tap. "Senator Bradley, I appreciate the opportunity, but Whitmore Tech doesn't take political positions. We provide software solutions regardless of..." Another tap. Third call. "The board meeting is confirmed for Thursday. Make sure the quarterly reports highlight the AI integration improvements. Numbers don't lie, gentlemen." This was Jonathan Whitmore in his element. Decisive, brilliant, always 3 steps ahead, managing a tech empire that had reshaped how Fortune 500 companies handled data security and artificial intelligence. He'd built this from nothing. A dorm room startup at MIT 20 years ago, fueled by ramen noodles and the absolute certainty that he could revolutionize the industry. He'd been right. Whitmore Tech was now worth billions. Their AI software ran operations in companies worldwide. Jonathan had been on the cover of Forbes, TechCrunch, Time magazine. He'd given a TED Talk that had been viewed 17 million times. He'd been called a visionary, a genius, the Steve Jobs of his generation. But at what cost? "Mr. Whitmore, you have the video call with Whitmore Academy's principal in 5 minutes, Marcus said, adjusting his glasses. Jonathan glanced at his watch. Another meeting. Always another meeting. Right. Set it up. He settled into his leather chair as Marcus connected the video feed. Principal Harrison appeared on the screen, a distinguished woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a professional smile that Jonathan had learned to read. When she smiled like that, she wanted something. Usually money. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for making time." "Of course. You mentioned Grace's progress?" "Yes." Principal Harrison's smile widened, becoming genuine. "I wanted to update you personally. Grace has shown remarkable improvement this semester. Her grades are up across the board, particularly in mathematics and literature, where she'd been struggling. Her teachers report she's more engaged, asking thoughtful questions, volunteering answers." Jonathan felt something warm bloom in his chest. Pride. Relief. When had he last felt proud of Grace without it being tinged with worry? That's excellent news. What changed? "We're not entirely sure," Principal Harrison admitted. "But whatever she's doing, whatever study methods she's employing, they're working. I wanted you to know that your daughter is thriving." "Whatever's working, keep doing it," Jonathan said. The words came easily. The certainty behind them felt hollow. Because the truth was, he had no idea what was working. He didn't know what Grace was doing differently. Didn't know if she'd found a new study group or finally clicked with one of her tutors, or simply matured enough to focus better. He didn't really know his daughter at all. The realization sat heavy in his chest long after the video call ended. Catherine would have known. The thought came unbidden, the way thoughts of his late wife always did, sudden and sharp, like stepping on glass. Catherine Whitmore, who died when Grace was 8. Cancer. Swift and brutal and utterly unfair. They'd had 5 years together as a family. 5 years of Catherine knowing exactly what Grace needed, exactly how to reach her, exactly how to make their daughter laugh. Catherine had been the heart of their home, the one who remembered birthdays and planned adventures and tucked Grace in at night with stories. When she died, she'd taken something vital with her. Something Jonathan had never figured out how to replace. He tried. God, he tried. But grief had its own gravity, and Jonathan had let work pull him down into a place where everything was numbers and strategies and problems he could actually solve. He'd hired the best nannies, the best tutors, made sure Grace had everything money could buy, everything except him. Money could buy a lot of things, Jonathan had learned, but it couldn't buy back time, couldn't buy connection, couldn't buy absolution for the guilt that kept him working late, taking calls during dinner, missing recitals and parent-teacher conferences. Couldn't buy back the father Grace deserved. He arrived home at 8:30 that evening. Late, but not as late as usual. The Beacon Hill brownstone was exactly as he'd left it that morning, pristine, perfectly maintained, utterly empty of life despite the 3 people who lived there. Jonathan could hear voices from the kitchen where Mrs. Chin, their housekeeper, was finishing dinner preparations. But the dining room was quiet. Grace sat alone at the massive mahogany table, eating pasta and reading a book. "Hey, sweetheart," Jonathan said, loosening his tie as he entered. Grace looked up, surprised. "Dad, you're home early." Was 8:30 early? When had that become early? "Mind if I join you?" "Sure." Grace set down her book, something for English class judging by the worn cover. Jonathan sat across from her, and Mrs. Chin appeared moments later with a plate for him. They ate in silence for a moment, the quiet punctuated only by the click of silverware against china. "How was school?" Jonathan asked. "Fine." "Grades good?" "Yes." "That's good." He paused, searching for something else to say. Something that would bridge the chasm between them. "What are you reading?" "To Kill a Mockingbird." "For English." "Good book. I read it in high school." "Cool." Another silence. This one longer, heavier. Jonathan watched his daughter push pasta around her plate. When had she gotten so grown up? She was almost 13 now. When had that happened? It felt like yesterday she was 8, crawling into his lap to show him crayon drawings, begging him to play tea party with her stuffed animals. Now she was almost a teenager and they talked like polite strangers. "Everything okay, Grace? You seem different lately." Grace's head snapped up, eyes wide. "Different how?" "Happier, I think. Mrs. Chin mentioned you've been humming. You never used to hum." Grace's cheeks flushed slightly. "Oh, I guess I've just been. I don't know. Things are better at school." "Because your grades are improving?" "Yeah. And I made a friend. A good friend." Jonathan smiled. "That's great. What's their name?" Grace hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Sophie." "Sophie. Is she in your class?" "We study together sometimes." "Well, you should invite her over sometime. Have a proper study session here." Grace's expression flickered with something Jonathan couldn't read. "Maybe. We'll see." The conversation drifted after that, back to safe topics. School assignments, weekend plans, whether Grace needed new school supplies. Surface-level questions that got surface-level answers. The chasm remained. But Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in Grace. Something fundamental and good. She did seem lighter. Happier. More confident. Later that week, Mrs. Chin confirmed it. "Miss Grace is different, Mr. Whitmore," the housekeeper said, catching him in the hallway. "She smiles more. Laughs more. Even her walk is different, not so hunched, you know? Like she's not trying to disappear." "You think it's this friend? Sophie?" "I think something is making her happy. And whatever it is, don't mess with it." Mrs. Chin gave him a pointed look. "That girl needs happiness." Jonathan nodded slowly. When had Grace been trying to disappear? How had he missed that? He pulled up his calendar on his phone, scanning the coming weeks. Wall-to-wall meetings. Conference calls with London, Tokyo, Dubai. A speaking engagement at Harvard. Another board meeting. Launch presentation for the new software update. But there. Next Tuesday afternoon. A rare 2-hour gap. On impulse, Jonathan made a decision. Marcus, he called to his assistant. Clear Tuesday afternoon. I'm taking Grace to lunch. Sir, you have the venture capital meeting with the Singapore investors. Reschedule it. I'm having lunch with my daughter. Marcus blinked, surprised, but nodded. Yes, sir. I'll make it happen. 2 days later, Jonathan sat in a board meeting at Whitmore Academy, one of the institutions that bore his family name thanks to his substantial donations over the years. The conference room was elegant, overlooking the manicured grounds. Around the table sat the principal, the board of trustees, and the development director. The new science wing is on schedule for completion by fall, Principal Harrison was saying, clicking through a presentation. Thanks to your generous contribution, Mr. Whitmore, we'll have state-of-the-art laboratories, updated technology, and increased capacity for AP Science courses. Polite applause around the table. Jonathan nodded, acknowledging it. We're also expanding the scholarship fund, the development director added. Your commitment to making Whitmore accessible to students from diverse economic backgrounds is truly transformative. You're changing lives, Mr. Whitmore. But am I changing Grace's life? Jonathan thought. He donated millions to this school, built wings and funded programs and endowed scholarships for students he'd never meet. But his own daughter, the one student whose life should matter most to him, remained a mystery. He knew her grades, knew her schedule, knew that her tutors cost more per hour than most people earned in a day. But he didn't know what made her happy. Didn't know about this friend Sophie who'd apparently helped her more than any expensive tutor had. Didn't know that when Grace hummed while doing homework, it was because someone had finally made her believe she wasn't stupid. The meeting continued, but Jonathan's mind drifted. Grace had mentioned "my friend" again at breakfast that morning. Casual, careful phrasing. My friend thinks I should approach the history essay from a different angle. My friend explained why I was getting the math wrong. Jonathan had assumed it was a classmate. Someone from one of Grace's classes. Why wouldn't he? He'd nodded, said something encouraging, and gone back to reading the financial reports on his tablet. He missed it. Missed the careful way Grace chose her words. Missed that she never said where they studied together, never mentioned inviting Sophie over, never offered details beyond the basics. He'd missed it because he wasn't really listening. Not the way a father should listen. The way Catherine would have listened. Jonathan's life existed in stark relief to struggles he'd never had to face. That morning, he'd woken up in a bedroom larger than some people's apartments. Had coffee, expensive, ethically sourced, prepared by Mrs. Chin, brought to him in a custom mug. Showered in a marble bathroom with heated floors. Dressed in clothes that cost more than many families spent on groceries in a month. His driver had picked him up in the Tesla. No waiting in cold. No crowded buses. No walking miles because public transportation wasn't an option. He'd had meetings in climate-controlled offices. Lunch delivered from a restaurant that required reservations weeks in advance. Conversations about millions of dollars thrown around like loose change. Meanwhile, somewhere in Boston, a girl named Sophie was digging through bakery dumpsters for day-old bread. Walking miles because she had no other choice. Taking shelter showers with water that alternated between scalding and freezing. Both girls touched Grace's life. But Jonathan didn't know that yet. Didn't know that his daughter's transformation, the happiness he'd noticed, the improved grades, the humming, came not from expensive tutors or private schools, but from a homeless girl who taught through a cracked window. Didn't know that the most important person in his daughter's life had nothing he could buy or provide. Didn't know that in exactly 4 days, his world and Sophie's would collide. He marked the calendar on Tuesday morning. Lunch with Grace, written in bold letters across the afternoon block. Maybe this would help. Maybe surprising her at school, taking her somewhere nice, really talking to her. Maybe that would start to bridge the gap between them. Maybe he could be the father Catherine had always believed he could be. Sometimes the best gifts are the ones we don't plan, Catherine used to say. Jonathan smiled at the memory, then closed his laptop and headed to his next meeting. He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. Tuesday arrived with clear skies and temperatures just warm enough to make sitting outside bearable. Sophie had checked the weather that morning, a habit born from years of needing to know whether she'd be soaked or frozen by nightfall, and felt a small spark of gratitude. At least today their lesson behind the library wouldn't involve numb fingers and chattering teeth. She settled her mother at the day shelter with the staff she'd come to trust, made sure Marilyn had eaten breakfast, and hurried toward Whitmore Academy. Her heart always beat a little faster on these walks now. Not from fear of being caught, though that fear never fully disappeared, but from anticipation. From knowing that in 20 minutes she'd be teaching someone who actually wanted to learn. Grace was already waiting when Sophie slipped through the gap in the fence at 12:30. She was practically bouncing with excitement, waving a paper in the air. Sophie, look. Sophie emerged from the bushes, brushing leaves from her jacket. What is it? I got an A on the history essay. An actual A. Grace thrust the paper toward her, and Sophie saw the grade written in red ink at the top, followed by a comment in neat handwriting, "Exceptional analysis of the American Revolution's causes. Your understanding of the economic and social factors is impressive. Well done, Grace." Sophie's face broke into a genuine smile, the kind that made her look her age instead of ancient. "See? I told you you're brilliant." "No, you're brilliant," Grace insisted, grabbing Sophie's hands. "You explained all of that. You made me understand it. This is because of you. This is because you did the work. I just helped you see what was already there." They settled into their usual spot behind the library, backs against the brick wall, Grace's textbooks spread between them. Today was French Revolution, another history essay due next week that Grace had been dreading. "Okay, so remember," Sophie said, pointing to Grace's notes, "the French Revolution wasn't just one event. It was a culmination of economic and social factors." Grace finished, her confidence visible in the way she sat straighter. "Exactly. See, you're getting it." Neither of them noticed the black Tesla pulling into the main parking lot. Neither of them heard the commotion as staff members recognized who had arrived. Neither of them knew that everything was about to change. Jonathan Whitmore stepped out of his car and was immediately greeted by Principal Harrison, who appeared so quickly she might have been summoned by magic. "Mr. Whitmore, what a wonderful surprise." She smoothed her suit jacket, her professional smile firmly in place. "We weren't expecting you today. Thought I'd surprise Grace with lunch," Jonathan said, glancing around the familiar grounds. He'd donated millions to this school, but he rarely visited during school hours. It looked different with students present. More alive, more purposeful. Other staff members appeared, drawn by the presence of their most generous benefactor. The development director. The vice principal. Even a few teachers who happened to be in the hallway. Jonathan raised a hand politely. "Thank you all, but I'm just here to see Grace. No need for fanfare." He turned to Principal Harrison. "Where would she be right now?" The principal checked her watch, then pulled out her phone to consult the schedule. "Study period. She's likely in the library, that's where most students go during this time. I'll find her." "Thank you." Jonathan walked through halls he'd funded but rarely visited. Students pressed against lockers as he passed, whispering to each other. He nodded to a few, offered a slight smile. Most looked intimidated. He supposed that made sense. Billionaire walking through their school, everyone knew who he was. The library was on the east wing. Quiet, well-lit, filled with students bent over books and laptops. Jonathan scanned the space. No Grace. The librarian, a young woman with kind eyes, approached. "Can I help you, Mr. Whitmore? I'm looking for my daughter." "Grace Whitmore?" "Oh yes. She was here earlier, but she left about 20 minutes ago." Jonathan frowned. "Do you know where she went?" "I'm sorry, I don't. Students often go outside during study period if the weather's nice. Perhaps she's on the grounds?" Jonathan thanked her and headed for the exit. He was about to return to the main building when movement outside a window caught his eye. Two figures sitting on the ground behind the library. Partially hidden by the building's angle, but visible if you knew where to look. One wore a perfect Whitmore uniform, navy blazer, plaid skirt, dark hair in a ponytail. Grace. The other wore clothes that looked like they'd been salvaged from a dumpster. No jacket despite the cold. No shoes. Thin to the point of concerning. Tangled hair. Hands gesturing animatedly as she spoke. Jonathan's confusion crystallized into concern. He walked outside, around the building, following the path that led to the service area. As he got closer, he could hear their voices. "Remember, the French Revolution wasn't just one event," the unknown girl was saying, her voice clear and confident despite her appearance. "It was a culmination of economic and social factors. The peasants were starving while the aristocracy lived in luxury. Can you imagine that? Having nothing while watching others have everything? It was a culmination of economic and social factors." Grace repeated, and Jonathan heard pride in his daughter's voice. "Exactly. See, you're getting it. Now, when you write about the Estates General." "Grace." Both girls froze mid-sentence. Grace's head whipped around, her face draining of all color. "Dad. What are you doing here?" The other girl, whoever she was, scrambled to her feet so fast she nearly tripped. She looked ready to bolt, her eyes darting toward the fence like a trapped animal calculating escape routes. Jonathan's eyes took in every detail. The girl's skeletal frame beneath clothes that hung off her like rags. Dirt smudged across her cheeks. Bare feet on cold concrete. But her eyes, intelligent, terrified, but sharp, fixed on him with an expression he'd seen in boardrooms. The look of someone who knew they'd been caught but refused to cower. "What's going on here?" Jonathan asked, his voice level. Grace stood, moving protectively in front of the other girl. "This is my friend." "Your friend?" Jonathan's tone carried skepticism, confusion. This girl was clearly homeless. Clearly didn't belong on school property. "Grace." "Her name is Sophie Brooks," Grace said, her voice strengthening with each word. "She's been helping me with school. She's the reason my grades are better. She's an amazing teacher." Jonathan's eyes fixed on Sophie, who stood frozen behind his daughter. "Helping you?" Sophie's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, sir. I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I just wanted to help. I'll leave. I won't come back. I promise." "Do you go to school here?" Jonathan interrupted. "No, sir." "Then what are you doing on school property?" Sophie's eyes dropped to the ground. I listened through the window. Behind the building. There's a crack. I can hear the classes. I teach myself, and then when Grace needed help, Where are your parents?" The question hung in the air. Sophie's hands trembled. "My mother, she's sick. Very sick. We don't have a home. We stay at shelters when there's space. Sometimes other places." "She's homeless," Jonathan said, not a question but a statement. "Yes, sir." Grace grabbed Sophie's hand, holding it tight. "Dad, she's the reason I'm doing better. All those tutors you paid for, none of them helped. But Sophie explains things in a way I actually understand. She's brilliant. Grace, she's homeless," Jonathan repeated, his voice harder. "You've been meeting with a homeless child behind the school? Do you understand how dangerous?" "Dangerous?" Grace's voice rose, defiant in a way Jonathan had never heard before. "She's not dangerous. She's smarter than anyone in there." She pointed at the school building. "She knows calculus and literature and history and chemistry, and she's never even been to school properly." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point, Dad?" Grace's eyes flashed. "That poor people can't be smart? That I should only have friends you approve of? That people like Sophie don't deserve help?" Jonathan opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw someone he barely recognized. Not because she'd changed physically, but because she was standing up to him. Fighting for someone. Passionate about something beyond grades and compliance. He turned back to Sophie, really seeing her now. Not just the poverty and the dirt, but the dignity in the way she stood. The way she'd moved protectively toward Grace even though she was terrified. The textbook clutched in her hands, and when he looked closer, he could see notes written in tiny, precise handwriting in the margins. This child was teaching his daughter? What were you teaching her just now? Jonathan asked, his tone shifting. Sophie hesitated. The French Revolution, sir. Explain it to me. The way you explained it to her. Dad, Grace started. It's okay, Sophie whispered. She took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice was clearer. The French Revolution was caused by multiple factors that created a perfect storm of unrest. Economically, France was bankrupt from wars and excessive spending by the monarchy. Socially, the Estates General system created massive inequality. The Third Estate bore the tax burden while the First and Second Estates lived in luxury. Intellectually, Enlightenment philosophy challenged the divine right of kings and promoted ideas of individual liberty and representative government. When these factors combined with bad harvests that left peasants starving, revolution became inevitable. Jonathan stared at her. The explanation was clear, comprehensive, and delivered with the confidence of someone who truly understood the material. How do you know all this? I listened, sir. Through the window. And I remember. Everything I hear, I remember. With no books? No computer? No formal education. I had 6 months of school once, 2nd grade, and I found books sometimes. And the library window. Sophie's voice was quiet but steady. I know I'm not supposed to be here. I know people like me don't belong. But I couldn't help it. Learning it's the only thing I have that the streets can't take away. The implication hit Jonathan like a physical blow. This child, homeless, hungry, sleeping in shelters, had taught herself enough to tutor his daughter. Had absorbed lessons through a cracked window and retained them with perfect clarity. Had given Grace something all his money couldn't buy, the belief that she was capable. This child was extraordinary. Silence stretched between them. Grace held Sophie's hand, both girls waiting for Jonathan's judgment. He could practically feel the weight of this moment, the way it balanced on a knife's edge. Protocol said he should call security. Remove this child from school property. Ensure it never happened again. Protect Grace from what? From intelligence? From compassion? From real friendship? From someone who saw value in his daughter beyond her last name? Jonathan's mind worked through the equation rapidly, the way he analyzed business decisions. Risk versus reward. Cost versus benefit. But this wasn't business. This was a child who'd been dealt the worst hand imaginable and had somehow, impossibly, turned it into something meaningful. Sophie, he said finally, his voice softer. Take me to your mother. Sophie's panic was immediate. Sir, please, she's not well. Don't punish her for what I did. She doesn't even know I come here. She doesn't know anything most days. Please. I'm not punishing anyone, Jonathan interrupted gently. I want to meet her. I want to understand your situation. Dad. Grace's voice was uncertain now. Jonathan looked at his daughter. At the fear in her eyes. The way she gripped Sophie's hand like she could protect her through sheer force of will. Trust me, he said quietly. 20 minutes later, Jonathan's Tesla was moving through parts of Boston he'd never visited. His driver kept glancing in the rearview mirror, confused by the directions. They left Beacon Hill's pristine streets behind, crossing into neighborhoods where buildings wore their age badly and people carried their lives in plastic bags. In the back seat, Grace held Sophie's hand while Sophie gave quiet directions, her voice trembling. Turn left here. No, sorry, right. It's near South Station. The day shelter. The blue building with the peeling paint. Jonathan sat in silence, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. Through calculations of cost and logistics. Through the staggering unfairness that a child this intelligent should be sleeping in a shelter. The car stopped outside a building that looked like it was one inspection away from being condemned. Graffiti covered the lower walls. The door hung slightly crooked. She's in there, Sophie whispered. Please be kind to her. She can't help being sick. She didn't choose this. Jonathan opened his door. I'm going to help her, Sophie. And I'm going to help you. Sophie's eyes filled with tears she clearly didn't want to shed. What? You don't even know us. Jonathan looked at this remarkable child who'd given his daughter something priceless, then stepped out of the car. Because my daughter vouches for you. And because no child this brilliant should be sleeping in a shelter. He walked toward the shelter door, toward Sophie's world, toward a decision that would change all their lives. Sometimes the best gifts really were the ones you didn't plan. The inside of the day shelter smelled like institutional soap, trying and failing to mask the reality of too many unwashed bodies in too small a space. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. Rows of folding chairs lined the walls, occupied by people in various states of exhaustion and despair. Some slept sitting up. Some stared at nothing. Some talked to themselves or to companions only they could see. Jonathan had written checks to homeless organizations before. Had his company donate computers and software to shelters. Had attended fundraising galas where homelessness was discussed over champagne and canapes. But he'd never actually been inside a shelter. Sophie led them through the room, her head down, acutely aware of every eye that followed them. A well-dressed billionaire and his daughter in a private school uniform didn't belong here. The contrast was obscene. "She's over there," Sophie whispered, pointing to a corner. Marilyn Brooks sat in a plastic chair, rocking slightly, staring at the wall. She was younger than Jonathan had expected. Maybe late 30s, though hardship had aged her. Her blonde hair hung in tangled clumps around a face that might have been pretty once. Her eyes were distant, unfocused, seeing things that existed only in her fractured mind. She was talking. Quiet, continuous muttering that made no sense. "Mommy," Sophie said softly, kneeling beside her mother's chair. "Mommy, I brought someone to help." Marilyn's head turned slowly, her gaze sliding past Sophie without recognition. "The birds are singing backwards. Do you hear them? Backwards, backwards, all the songs are wrong." Sophie's face crumpled for just a moment before she composed herself. Jonathan watched this 12-year-old child summon strength she shouldn't have to possess, putting on a brave face for a mother who didn't even know she had a daughter. Jonathan crouched beside them, his expensive suit ridiculously out of place on the stained concrete floor. "Mrs. Brooks? My name is Jonathan Whitmore." Marilyn didn't respond. Her lips kept moving, forming words that followed some internal logic only she understood. "She has depression," Sophie explained, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Severe. Clinical," the free clinic doctor said. "She needs medication, but they give her a month's supply and then she has to wait in line again to get more, and sometimes they're out, and when she doesn't have it, she gets like this. Lost. She forgets who I am. Forgets everything." Jonathan studied Marilyn, and in one moment of clarity, just a flicker, her eyes focused. She looked at him directly and he saw intelligence there. Saw a person trapped inside a broken mind. "You're real, aren't you?" Marilyn whispered. "Not a shadow. Real." "I'm real," Jonathan confirmed gently. Then the moment passed and Marilyn's eyes went distant again. "The shadows pretend to be real. But the birds know. The birds always know." Jonathan pulled out his phone and stepped away slightly, scrolling through his contacts. He found the name he needed and tapped it. Dr. Elizabeth Chin answered on the second ring. "Jonathan?" "What?" "Liz, I need a favor. Emergency psychiatric evaluation and treatment. Full care. Your facility." "Jonathan, you know we have a waiting list." "This can't wait. I have a woman here in crisis and her daughter." He glanced at Sophie, who was watching him with desperate hope in her eyes. "Her daughter needs her mother back. Whatever it costs. Whatever it takes." Pause. "Then, tell me the situation." Jonathan explained briefly, clinically, the way he explained business problems. But his voice softened when he mentioned Sophie teaching grace, teaching herself through a window. "Bring her in," Dr. Chin said finally. "I'll have a team ready." "Jonathan, you know recovery from this level of depression takes time." "I know. But she needs to start somewhere. And that somewhere is now." He ended the call and turned to find Sophie staring at him, tears streaming down her face. "Sir, we can't afford," she started. "I can," Jonathan interrupted. "Consider it handled." "But why would you?" "Because," Jonathan said, crouching so he was eye level with Sophie, "you taught my daughter something I couldn't. That kindness and intelligence aren't about money. That the most valuable things can't be bought. You gave her confidence, friendship, belief in herself. Let me do this." A shelter social worker approached, her expression wary. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but you can't just take someone from." Jonathan stood, and something in his posture, the authority he carried naturally, the wealth evident in every detail of his appearance, made the woman pause. "My name is Jonathan Whitmore. I'm arranging immediate psychiatric care for Mrs. Brooks at McLean Hospital with Dr. Elizabeth Chen. If you need documentation, my lawyer can provide it. If you need authorization, I can have it within the hour. But that woman needs help now, and her daughter needs stability. Are we going to have a problem?" The social worker looked at Marilyn, then at Sophie's tear-stained face, then back at Jonathan. "No, sir. No problem. I'll get her intake paperwork." An hour later, an ambulance pulled up outside the shelter. Not the standard emergency ambulance, but a private medical transport with comfortable seating and trained psychiatric staff. Sophie refused to leave her mother's side, climbing into the ambulance and holding Marilyn's hand as the EMTs checked her vital signs and spoke to her in calm, professional tones. "You can visit her," Jonathan told Sophie through the open door. "Every day if you want. But tonight you're coming home with us." Sophie's head snapped up. "Home? Really, Dad?" Grace asked, hope blazing in her eyes. "Really?" Jonathan looked at both girls, his daughter and the homeless child who'd changed her life. "Sophie, you can't go back to the shelters. Not now. Not when we can help." I can't impose." "You're not imposing. You're accepting help. There's a difference." The ambulance doors closed, and Sophie watched through the window as it pulled away, taking her mother toward a real chance at healing. Then she turned to Jonathan and Grace, standing beside the Tesla, waiting for her. For the first time in 3 years, Sophie wasn't alone. The Whitmore mansion in Beacon Hill was more overwhelming than Sophie had imagined. 5 stories of historic brownstone, with marble floors that reflected the light from crystal chandeliers, walls covered in original artwork, furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Sophie stood in the foyer, frozen, terrified to move in case she tracked dirt on something priceless. Mrs. Chin, the housekeeper, appeared from a hallway. She took one look at Sophie, the dirt, the torn clothes, the bare feet, and her eyes widened. Then she looked at Jonathan. "Mrs. Chin, this is Sophie Brooks," Jonathan said firmly. "She'll be staying with us. Please prepare the guest room next to Grace's. And Sophie will need." He gestured at her clothes. "Everything." Mrs. Chin's professional mask slipped back into place immediately. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore." "Sophie, welcome to the Whitmore home." "Thank you," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. Grace grabbed Sophie's hand. "Come on. I'll show you your room." She pulled Sophie up the grand staircase, past family portraits and expensive decorations to the 3rd floor. Grace's room was twice the size of the entire shelter common area. A 4-poster bed, a desk, bookshelves overflowing with books, a window seat overlooking the street. "And this," Grace said, opening a door, "is yours." The guest room was smaller than Grace's but still massive by Sophie's standards. A real bed with a thick comforter. A dresser. A closet. A private bathroom. Sophie couldn't speak. Couldn't process. This couldn't be real. "First things first," Grace announced. "You need a shower. A real shower. With hot water and soap and shampoo and everything." She led Sophie into the bathroom. All marble and chrome and fixtures that probably cost more than Sophie's mother had earned in a year. Grace showed her how the temperature controls worked, laid out towels that were soft and fluffy, lined up bottles of shampoo and conditioner and body wash. "Take as long as you want," Grace said. "I'll find you some clean clothes." After Grace left, Sophie stood under the hot water for 20 minutes, watching years of accumulated dirt and grime swirl down the drain. She used the shampoo 3 times before her hair felt clean. She scrubbed her skin until it was pink and raw and finally free of the street's residue. When she emerged, wrapped in a towel that felt like a cloud, clean pajamas were laid out on the bed. Grace's pajamas, soft and warm and smelling like fabric softener. Sophie dressed slowly, then approached the mirror. The face looking back at her was a stranger. Clean skin, free of dirt and bruises. Hair that was actually blonde, not the indeterminate gray-brown of filth. eyes that looked young again instead of ancient. "That's who you really are," Grace said softly, appearing in the doorway. "You just couldn't see it through the dirt." Sophie touched her own reflection, disbelieving. "I forgot," she whispered. "I forgot I could look like this." Dinner was in the formal dining room, and Sophie's terror returned when she saw the table settings. Multiple forks, multiple spoons, glasses of different sizes. She had no idea which to use when. Jonathan noticed immediately. He made a phone call, and 20 minutes later pizza arrived. "I've been craving pizza all day," he announced, clearing away the formal settings and replacing them with paper plates. "Hope everyone's okay with casual tonight." Sophie could have cried with relief. They sat around the table, billionaire, billionaire's daughter, and homeless girl, eating pizza like a normal family. Jonathan asked about Sophie's life, her learning, her dreams. Grace chimed in with stories about their tutoring sessions. Mrs. Chen brought them sodas and dessert and pretended not to notice when Sophie ate 3 slices and still looked hungry. Sophie's walls began to crumble. Carefully at first, then more freely. She talked about Mrs. Patterson, about teaching herself through bookstore windows, about the 6 months of school she'd managed before everything fell apart. "What do you want to be?" Jonathan asked. "When you're older. If you could be anything." Sophie had never let herself think that far ahead. Survival didn't allow for dreams of the future. But now, in this warm house with a full stomach and people who actually seemed to care, she let herself imagine. "A teacher," she said quietly. "I want to help kids like me. Kids who think they're not smart enough or not worthy enough. I want to show them they are." Jonathan smiled. "Then that's what you'll be." After dinner, Jonathan disappeared into his study to make phone calls. Sophie could hear his voice through the door, authoritative and decisive, discussing legal guardianship, school enrollment, psychiatric treatment plans. Making her mother's healing possible. Making Sophie's future possible. Making the impossible real. When he emerged, he found Sophie and Grace in the living room, Grace showing Sophie her favorite books. "Tomorrow we're going shopping," Jonathan announced. "School uniforms, clothes, supplies. Everything you'll need." "I can't accept all this," Sophie protested weakly. "It's too much. Sophie, you've been teaching my daughter for free. Giving her something I couldn't buy with all my money. Let me do this, please." "Plus," Grace added, grinning, "you're going to be my classmate now. We can finally study together for real." Sophie looked between them, father and daughter, offering her a life she'd only dreamed about. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Jonathan said with a slight smile. "Wait until you've survived Mrs. Chen's breakfast standards. She's very particular about how eggs should be cooked." That night, Sophie lay in an actual bed for the first time in years. Clean sheets, a soft pillow, a comforter that weighed just enough to feel like security. Across the room, Grace had insisted on sleeping in the guest room too. "So you're not alone your first night," she'd explained. She was already asleep in the twin bed Mrs. Chen had moved in, breathing softly. Sophie stared at the ceiling, trying to convince herself this was real. "Mrs. Patterson," she whispered to the darkness, "if you can hear me somehow, someone saw me again. Someone help. You were right. I am worth something." She closed her eyes, expecting to wake up on a shelter cot, expecting this to be a dream her mind had conjured to make the cold more bearable. "This can't last," she thought. "It's too good. Tomorrow I'll wake up and be back in the shelter. This is just a beautiful dream." But when morning came, she woke to sunlight streaming through real windows, to the smell of coffee and breakfast cooking downstairs, to Grace's voice saying, "Sophie? You awake?" Mrs. Chen made pancakes. Sophie sat up slowly, touching the soft sheets, the clean pajamas, her own clean skin. This was real. This was her life now. And for the first time in 3 years, Sophie let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. The first week in the Whitmore mansion was harder than Sophie had expected. Not because anyone was unkind. Jonathan, Grace, and Mrs. Chen went out of their way to make her feel welcome. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was an imposter. That any moment, someone would realize the mistake they'd made and send her back to the streets where she belonged. She was terrified to touch anything. The furniture looked too expensive to sit on. The towels too nice to use. The food too abundant to eat without guilt. She moved through the house like a ghost, trying to take up as little space as possible, trying not to be a burden. The nightmares were worst. She'd wake up screaming, convinced she was back on the streets. Back in the cold. Back in the shelter with her mother rocking beside her, lost in madness. The transition from concrete to comfort was so abrupt her mind couldn't process it. In her dreams, the mansion dissolved like smoke, leaving her alone in the dark. The first time it happened, Grace appeared in her doorway within seconds. Sophie? Sophie, it's okay. You're safe. You're home. Sophie sat up, gasping, her heart hammering. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to wake you. Stop apologizing. Grace climbed into bed beside her, wrapping an arm around Sophie's shaking shoulders. You're safe. You're home. I promise. Home. The word felt foreign in Sophie's mouth, like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. What if I wake up and this is all gone? Sophie whispered. What if I'm back there? You won't be. Dad made sure of it. You're not going anywhere. But it took weeks before Sophie could sleep through the night without jerking awake, checking that the soft bed and warm blankets were still real. Her first day at Whitmore Academy as an official student was simultaneously the best and worst day of her life. Jonathan had taken her shopping the week before, a surreal experience where she tried on uniform after uniform, each one fitting perfectly, each one making her look like she belonged. Grace had helped her pick out regular clothes too. Jeans that didn't have holes. Shirts that weren't stained. Shoes that actually matched and didn't require duct tape. When Sophie looked in the mirror that first morning, wearing the navy blazer with gold trim, the white shirt, the plaid skirt, she almost didn't recognize herself. You look perfect, Grace announced, adjusting Sophie's collar. Ready? Sophie wasn't. But she nodded anyway. They arrived together, walking through the main gate side by side. No more hiding behind buildings. No more crouching by windows. Sophie was walking through the front door as a student. But the stares started immediately. Everyone knew who she was. News traveled fast in wealthy circles. The billionaire who'd taken in a homeless girl, the charity case now attending the most exclusive school in Boston. Students whispered behind their hands. Teachers looked at her with expressions ranging from pity to curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. In her first class, AP English Literature, she took a seat near the back, trying to be invisible. But invisibility was no longer possible. I heard she was homeless, a girl whispered loudly to her friend in the next row. Like actually homeless? Sleeping in shelters and everything. Is that even allowed? Another voice responded. Don't you have to pass some kind of entrance exam? Sophie's cheeks burned. She stared at her desk, wishing she could disappear through the floor. She's only here because of Grace's dad, someone else added. Total charity case. Grace spun in her seat, eyes flashing. Her name is Sophie and she's smarter than any of you. So maybe shut up and mind your own business. The whispers quieted, but Sophie could still feel the stares, the judgment, the certainty that she didn't belong here. Maybe they were right. But then came the moment that began to shift everything. In AP Calculus, the teacher, Mr. Harrison, a patient man with a reputation for making difficult concepts accessible, was working through a complex derivative problem on the board. He paused, frowning at his own work. I think I made an error somewhere in this sequence. Can anyone spot it? Silence. Students stared at the board blankly. Sophie saw it immediately. The mistake was in the third line. He'd incorrectly applied the chain rule. But she stayed quiet, terrified of drawing attention to herself. Sophie? Mr. Harrison said, and her heart stopped. You're new, but I've heard interesting things about your mathematical abilities. What do you think? She had no choice now. Everyone was looking at her. You applied the chain rule incorrectly in line 3, Sophie said quietly. When you differentiated the composite function, you forgot to multiply by the derivative of the inner function. Mr. Harrison studied the board, then his face cleared. You're absolutely right. Thank you, Sophie. He corrected the error, then turned back to the class. Can you walk us through how you'd solve this from that point? Sophie stood on shaking legs and approached the board. She took the marker with trembling hands and began writing, her solution elegant and efficient. She explained each step clearly, the way she'd explained things to Grace dozens of times behind the library. When she finished and turned around, the class was staring, but not with pity anymore, with something closer to awe. That was, Mr. Harrison said slowly, exceptional. Your method is actually more efficient than mine. Where did you learn to approach problems like that? I taught myself, sir. From listening through. She stopped, realizing what she'd almost said. From books. And practice. One boy in the front row raised his hand. Can you explain that middle part again? The way you simplified the fraction. Sophie did. And suddenly she wasn't the charity case anymore. She was the girl who could solve problems they couldn't. The shift wasn't universal. But it was a start. Madison Pierce and her group made sure Sophie never forgot she was an outsider. Madison was everything Sophie wasn't. Old money, perfectly styled, confident in the way people were when they'd never experienced real hardship. She and her friends made Sophie's life miserable in small, calculated ways. Nice shoes, Madison said one day, her tone dripping with false sweetness. Are those from the donation bin, or did Mr. Whitmore actually buy you new ones? Sophie looked down at her shoes, new, expensive, perfectly fine. But Madison had a talent for making everything feel inadequate. Leave her alone, Madison, Grace snapped. What? I'm just curious how the charity project is working out. I mean, you don't belong here, Sophie. You're only here because of Grace's dad. Everyone knows it. The words hurt because they were partly true. Sophie was here because of Jonathan. Without him, she'd still be sleeping in shelters, listening through windows, invisible to everyone. Actually, Sophie said quietly, surprising herself, I'm here because I worked for it. I taught myself everything while you were having knowledge handed to you on a silver platter. So maybe I belong here more than you do. Madison's eyes narrowed. You little? Sophie is my best friend, Grace interrupted, stepping between them. She earned her place here. She's brilliant and kind and brave. And if you have a problem with that, Madison, that's your problem. Not hers. So get over it. Madison and her friends walked away, but Sophie knew this wasn't over. People like Madison didn't forgive being stood up to. But Grace had stood up for her. That mattered more than Madison's cruelty ever could. Every Saturday, Jonathan drove Sophie to McLean Hospital to visit her mother. The facility was beautiful. More like a resort than a hospital, with manicured grounds and private rooms and staff who treated patients with dignity. Sophie could never have afforded this. Could never have even dreamed of it. The first few visits were hard. Marilyn didn't recognize her. Stared at Sophie like she was a stranger, eyes distant and confused. Who are you? She'd ask. Why do you keep coming here? I'm Sophie, Sophie would answer, fighting back tears. I'm your daughter. I don't have a daughter. I don't have anything. But Dr. Chin assured Sophie this was normal. Recovery isn't linear. With medication, therapy, and time she'll improve. But you need to be patient. Sophie was patient. She came every week without fail, even when Marilyn didn't know her, even when it hurt so much Sophie wanted to scream. And slowly, incrementally, Marilyn began to come back. Week 5, she looked at Sophie and said, You look familiar. Week 7, she said, I had a daughter named Sophie once. Week 10, she held Sophie's hand and whispered, My Sophie, my bright star. Sophie sobbed so hard she couldn't breathe. I'm here, Mom. I'm here. I never left. I'm right here. Marilyn's eyes were clearer than Sophie had seen them in years. What happened? Where are we? You're getting better. You're getting help. Real help. How? Someone saw us, Mom. Someone helped. Dr. Chin found them like that, mother and daughter holding each other, both crying, both beginning to heal. She smiled softly and closed the door to give them privacy. Later, Dr. Chin told Sophie, with continued treatment, your mother can recover significantly. She'll likely always need medication and therapy, but she can have a real life again. You both can. At home, the dynamic between Jonathan, Grace, and Sophie evolved from awkward to something resembling family. Jonathan started coming home earlier. Started having dinner with them most nights. He'd ask about their day, help with homework, tell stories about his own academic struggles at MIT. One evening, he taught them both about his business, explaining artificial intelligence and machine learning in terms they could understand. He treated Sophie exactly the same as Grace, asking her opinion, valuing her insights, never making her feel like the charity case she sometimes feared she was. "Why are you really doing this?" Sophie asked one night after Grace had gone to bed. She'd found Jonathan in his study, working late despite his earlier promise to himself. Jonathan looked up from his laptop. "Doing what?" "All of this. Taking me in. Paying for my mom's treatment. Sending me to school. You don't owe me anything. You could have just helped a little and sent me on my way." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. Then he closed his laptop and gestured for Sophie to sit. "Do you know what Grace was like before she met you?" he asked. Sophie shook her head. She was withdrawn. Quiet. She thought she was stupid because school didn't come easily to her. She thought I was disappointed in her. We barely spoke beyond surface pleasantries. He paused. "Then she met you. And everything changed. She started believing in herself. Started standing up for herself. Started smiling and laughing and humming while she did homework. That was her, not me." "It was you," Jonathan interrupted gently. "You gave her something I couldn't buy with all my money, genuine friendship, real support, belief in her potential. You reminded both of us what actually matters. Not wealth or status, but kindness and effort and seeing people for who they really are." He leaned forward. "You changed my daughter's life, Sophie. Let me change yours. Because Grace needs you. And honestly, I think I need you too. You remind me to be a better father." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just don't waste this chance. Be brilliant. Be yourself. That's all I ask." Grace's transformation was remarkable to witness. With Sophie beside her, Grace's confidence soared. She volunteered answers in class, made presentations without trembling, spoke up when she disagreed with something. One day, she had to present a history project in front of the entire class. Sophomore year, she would have been terrified. But now, with Sophie sitting in the back row giving her an encouraging thumbs up, Grace spoke clearly and confidently about the civil rights movement. When she finished, the class actually applauded. Mr. Harrison wrote A+ on her evaluation sheet and commented, "Outstanding work, Grace. Your analysis was thoughtful and well-researched." After class, Madison made one more attempt to undermine them. "Must be nice having your personal tutor watch you present," she sneered. "Does she write your papers too?" Grace didn't even flinch. "Sophie is my best friend. She helps me understand things, but I do my own work. Maybe if you spent less time being jealous and more time actually studying, you'd do better too." Madison's face flushed with anger, but she had no comeback. Grace walked away with her head high, Sophie beside her, both of them grinning. Their bond had deepened beyond friendship. They were sisters now in every way that mattered. But Sophie's insecurity still lurked beneath the surface. One evening, she overheard a conversation between Jonathan and a business associate who'd stopped by the house. "Jonathan, are you sure about this?" the man was saying. "Taking in a homeless girl? What do you really know about her background? This could be a liability." "She's not a homeless girl." Jonathan's voice was firm, harder than Sophie had ever heard it. "Her name is Sophie. She's brilliant, she's kind, and she's family now. And yes, I'm sure. More sure than I've been about anything in years. But the optics? I don't care about optics. I care about doing what's right. Sophie deserves this chance, and I'm not going to apologize for giving it to her." Sophie should have felt reassured. But doubt still whispered in her mind. What if he changes his mind? What if I'm not worth all this trouble? What if I let him down? 3 months after Jonathan found Sophie behind the library, he made an announcement at dinner. "I've decided to establish a new scholarship fund," he said. "The Sophie Brooks Scholarship Fund. It will provide full tuition, housing support, and mental health resources for homeless students who show exceptional academic promise." Sophie's fork clattered onto her plate. "You what?" I named it after you. To honor your journey. To help other kids like you get the chances they deserve. But I'm not. Sophie couldn't form words. You're changing more lives than you know, Sophie, Jonathan said softly. Your story matters. Your determination matters. And there are other kids out there just like you, brilliant but invisible. This scholarship will help them be seen. Sophie burst into tears. Grace grabbed her hand. Jonathan smiled. You don't have to do anything, he assured her. Just keep being yourself. Keep proving that intelligence and worth have nothing to do with circumstances. That's enough. That night, Sophie wrote in the journal Grace had given her, a beautiful leather-bound book she'd been too intimidated to use until now. 3 months ago, I was sleeping in shelters and teaching myself through a cracked window. Today I have a home, a family, and a scholarship named after me. I don't know what I did to deserve this second chance. I don't know why Jonathan saw something in me worth saving. But I won't waste it. I promise I won't waste it. Mom is getting better. Grace is thriving. And me? I'm learning what it feels like to be seen. To be valued. To be home. I'm scared every day that I'll wake up and this will be gone. But Grace tells me that's normal. That healing takes time. That I'm allowed to be scared and grateful at the same time. So I'm trying. Trying to believe I deserve this. Trying to believe I belong. She was about to close the journal when Grace knocked on her door. Sophie? You have a visitor downstairs. Sophie's heart jumped. Who? Grace grinned. Someone named Mrs. Patterson. She said she's been looking for you. Sophie's breath caught. Mrs. Patterson. The woman who'd seen her first. The woman who'd started all of this by believing a homeless girl in a soup kitchen deserved better. Sophie ran downstairs, her heart full of hope and gratitude and the overwhelming certainty that sometimes, the most broken stories could have the most beautiful endings. Mrs. Patterson lived in a modest assisted living facility in Somerville, about 30 minutes from Beacon Hill. Sophie had tracked her down through the soup kitchen's old contact list, her heart pounding with equal parts hope and anxiety. What if Mrs. Patterson didn't remember her? What if she was angry that Sophie had vanished without explanation? But Sophie needed to see her. Needed to thank the woman who'd seen her first, who'd planted the seed of belief that had eventually bloomed into this new life. Are you sure about this? Grace asked as Jonathan's Tesla pulled into the parking lot. What if she's not? What if? She'll remember, Sophie said with certainty. Mrs. Patterson always remembered. They walked through the bright, clean hallways, such a stark contrast to the soup kitchen basement where they'd first met. A nurse directed them to the community room, where residents gathered for activities and visits. Mrs. Patterson sat by a window reading a book, her silver hair catching the afternoon light. She looked older, more tired, but still dignified in that same practical cardigan she'd always worn. Mrs. Patterson? Sophie's voice trembled. The older woman looked up. For a moment, confusion flickered across her face. Then recognition hit like lightning and the book tumbled from her hands. Sophie? Is that really you? It's me. Sophie rushed forward as Mrs. Patterson stood, and they met in an embrace that made both of them cry. Oh, my dear girl. My dear, dear girl. Mrs. Patterson pulled back, cupping Sophie's face with trembling hands. Look at you. You're clean. You're healthy. You're... Her eyes traveled to the Whitmore Academy uniform Sophie wore. You're in school? I am. Because of you. You saw me first, Mrs. Patterson. You started all of this. Mrs. Patterson's gaze shifted to Grace and Jonathan, standing respectfully back. Her eyes widened. Jonathan Whitmore? The Jonathan Whitmore? Jonathan stepped forward, extending his hand. Mrs. Patterson, I've heard so much about you. Sophie credits you with saving her life. I didn't save anything, Mrs. Patterson said, wiping her eyes. I saw a bright child who needed help. And then I failed her when my husband... Her voice broke. You didn't fail me, Sophie said fiercely. You gave me hope when I had none. You made me believe I was worth something. Everything that happened after, everything good, started with you. They sat together and Mrs. Patterson shared her story. Her husband was recovering, slowly but steadily. The medical bills had been catastrophic, but they were managing. She'd had to close the soup kitchen, and the guilt of abandoning the people who depended on it, especially Sophie, had haunted her every day. "I looked for you," she admitted. "I went to the shelters, asked around, but no one knew where you'd gone. I was terrified something terrible had happened." "Something wonderful happened," Sophie corrected. She told the story, meeting Grace, teaching through the window, Jonathan discovering them, the life she had now. Mrs. Patterson listened with tears streaming down her face. "You did this," Jonathan said when Sophie finished. "You planted the seeds that led to Sophie's transformation. If you hadn't shown her she was worth investing in, she might never have had the courage to help Grace. You started the chain of events that changed all our lives." "I wish I could have done more," Mrs. Patterson whispered. "You did everything you could," Sophie said. "And now I want to do something for you." She looked at Jonathan, who nodded. "Mr. Whitmore has offered to help with your remaining medical bills," Sophie said. "All of them. So you can focus on your husband's recovery without the financial burden." Mrs. Patterson's hands flew to her mouth. "I couldn't possibly." "You can," Jonathan said firmly. "Consider it thanks for what you did for Sophie. And for what you taught all of us about seeing people's true worth." Mrs. Patterson cried then, deep, grateful sobs that spoke of months of crushing worry finally lifting. Sophie held her, this woman who'd been the first to believe in her, and whispered, "Thank you for everything. You gave me the greatest gift. You made me believe I was worth something." "You always were, dear girl," Mrs. Patterson said through her tears. "You always were." The end of Sophie's first semester at Whitmore Academy arrived with a flurry of final exams and presentations. Sophie approached each one with the same focused intensity she'd brought to teaching herself through bookstore windows, except now she had resources, support, and a place to belong. When grades were posted, Sophie had perfect scores across every subject. But more than that, she'd earned the respect of her teachers and most of her classmates. Even those who'd initially dismissed her as the charity case had grudgingly acknowledged her brilliance. The academic achievement ceremony was held in Whitmore's auditorium, a grand space with velvet seats and a stage that seemed impossibly large. Parents filled the seats, dressed in their finest, cameras ready. Sophie sat between Grace and Jonathan, her heart hammering as Principal Harrison announced the award recipients. Outstanding Achievement in Mathematics, Sophie Brooks. Applause filled the auditorium as Sophie walked to the stage on shaking legs. Mr. Harrison handed her the certificate with a warm smile. "You're extraordinary, Sophie," he said quietly. "Never doubt that. Excellence in Literature, Sophie Brooks. Scientific Achievement Award, Sophie Brooks." By the fourth award, the applause had shifted from polite to enthusiastic. Students who'd watched her solve impossible problems, who'd heard her articulate analyses in English class, who'd witnessed her dedication, they were genuinely celebrating her success. Even Madison Pierce was clapping, though reluctantly, her face tight with something that might have been respect or resignation. When Sophie returned to her seat with an armful of certificates, Jonathan squeezed her shoulder. "Proud of you, kid." The words made Sophie's chest swell with warmth. When had she last heard those words from a parental figure? When had anyone been proud of her for something other than simply surviving? At the end of the ceremony, Principal Harrison invited Sophie back to the stage for one final recognition. "This year we've had the privilege of witnessing something remarkable," the principal said. "A student who overcame circumstances that would have broken most people. Who taught herself through sheer determination and intellectual hunger. Who reminds us all that excellence has nothing to do with privilege and everything to do with character." She turned to Sophie. "Would you like to say a few words?" Sophie hadn't prepared a speech. But standing there, looking out at the sea of faces, some kind, some curious, some still skeptical, she knew what she needed to say. "6 months ago I was invisible," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "I was homeless, hungry, and convinced that the world had no place for someone like me. I taught myself by listening through a window because I couldn't afford to be inside. I dreamed of sitting in a real classroom, but I never believed it would happen." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Then someone saw me. Actually saw me, Not the dirt or the poverty, but the person underneath. And that changed everything. Mrs. Patterson saw me first at a soup kitchen. Grace saw me behind the library. Mr. Whitmore saw me when he could have just as easily looked away. Her eyes found Jonathan and Grace in the audience. Both were crying. Being smart doesn't make you special. Lots of people are smart. What makes a difference is having people who believe in you, who invest in you, who refuse to let you be invisible. She addressed the full auditorium now. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for letting me prove that where you come from doesn't define where you can go. And to anyone who feels invisible, who thinks they don't belong, you do. You absolutely do. You just need someone to see you. And I hope I can be that someone for other people the way so many have been for me. The standing ovation started with Jonathan and Grace, but it spread. Teachers, students, parents rising to their feet. Even the skeptics. Even Madison. Sophie stood there, overwhelmed, finally understanding what it meant to be truly seen. 2 weeks later, Sophie received the call she'd been praying for. Sophie? Dr. Chen's voice was warm over the phone. Your mother has made remarkable progress. We're discharging her to outpatient care. She's ready to start rebuilding her life. Sophie could barely breathe. She's really better? She'll need ongoing medication and therapy. Depression is a chronic condition and she'll have to manage it for life. But yes, Sophie, she's better. She's herself again. The day Marilyn was discharged, Sophie, Grace, and Jonathan were there to meet her. Marilyn emerged from the facility looking like a completely different person. Clean, healthy, her eyes clear and focused. When she saw Sophie, she broke down crying. My baby. My brilliant, beautiful baby. Marilyn pulled Sophie into her arms, holding her so tight Sophie could barely breathe. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything you went through. For not being there. For not protecting you. You were sick, Mom, Sophie said, crying into her mother's shoulder. It wasn't your fault. You're getting better. That's all that matters. They stood there in the parking lot, mother and daughter reunited, both of them crying and laughing and holding each other like they'd never let go again. Dr. Chin joined them with final instructions. Marilyn will be living in a supervised apartment complex for now, she explained. She'll have weekly therapy sessions and monthly check-ins with me. With continued treatment and support, she can have a full, meaningful life again. We'll help, Jonathan said immediately. Whatever she needs, rent, medical costs, anything, consider it handled. Marilyn looked at him with tears streaming down her face. Why? Why would you do this for us? Because Sophie is family now, Jonathan said simply. And that makes you family too. The legal proceedings to make Jonathan Sophie's official guardian were surprisingly emotional. They sat in a courtroom in late spring, sunlight streaming through tall windows. The judge, a kind-faced woman in her 60s, reviewed the paperwork carefully, then looked at Sophie over her reading glasses. Sophie Brooks, I need to ask you directly, is this what you want? Do you want Jonathan Whitmore to become your legal guardian? Sophie stood, her voice clear and strong. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Whitmore gave me a family when I had none. He gave me a home when I was homeless. He gave me a future when I thought I had no chance. He sees me, really sees me, not as a charity case or a project, but as a person worth investing in. She looked at Jonathan, who was trying not to cry. He taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up, who stays, who believes in you even when you don't believe in yourself. Mr. Whitmore did all of that. So yes, this is what I want. The judge smiled softly. Mr. Whitmore, would you like to respond? Jonathan stood, his composure finally cracking. Your Honor, Sophie said I gave her a family and a future. But the truth is, she gave me something more valuable. She gave me back my daughter. Before Sophie, Grace and I were strangers living in the same house. Sophie taught me how to be a father again. How to see what really matters. How to be present. He looked at both girls. I'm not saving Sophie. She's saving me. Every single day. The judge dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Well then. I don't think I've ever had an easier decision to make. She signed the papers with a flourish. Guardianship is granted. Congratulations to you all. Sophie flew into Jonathan's arms, sobbing. Grace joined them, creating a three-person hug that made everyone in the courtroom reach for tissues. They were officially family now. Life settled into a rhythm over the following months. A beautiful, normal rhythm that Sophie had never experienced before. Dinners together every night, all of them sharing stories about their days. Grace and Sophie doing homework side by side, sometimes teaching each other, sometimes just enjoying each other's company. Weekend outings, movies, museums, bookstores where Sophie could browse for hours without being chased away. Marilyn joined them for supervised visits once a week, slowly rebuilding her relationship with Sophie. The visits were careful at first, tentative, both of them learning how to be mother and daughter again. But gradually the old warmth returned. Marilyn would tell stories from before the Depression, stories Sophie had almost forgotten. Sophie would share her school achievements, and Marilyn would cry with pride. "I missed so much," Marilyn said one afternoon, holding Sophie's hand. "Years of your life. I can't get those back." "No," Sophie agreed. "But we have now. And tomorrow. And the day after that. We have time, Mom." The Whitmore mansion stopped feeling like a museum and started feeling like home. Sophie no longer walked on eggshells, afraid to touch anything. She sprawled on the furniture. She raided the kitchen for midnight snacks. She left her books scattered in the living room. She belonged here, and she finally believed it. Sophie and Grace co-founded a tutoring program at Whitmore called the Sophie and Grace Academy Project. Every Tuesday and Thursday after school, they worked with struggling students. Kids who felt stupid, who couldn't understand their teachers, who thought they didn't belong at such a prestigious school. Sophie and Grace taught them the way Sophie had taught Grace. Patiently, kindly, breaking down concepts until they clicked. "You're not dumb," Sophie told a freshman boy who was nearly failing algebra. "You just learn differently. Let me show you another way to think about this." 15 minutes later, the boy was solving problems he'd struggled with for weeks. His face lit up with the same revelation Sophie had seen in Grace a year ago. "I get it. I actually get it. See?" Sophie smiled. "You just needed someone to explain it differently. That doesn't make you stupid. It makes you human." The program grew quickly. Students who'd once sneered at Sophie now sought her help. She and Grace became known not as the billionaire's daughter and her charity case, but as the tutors who actually make things make sense. For Sophie, it was more than helping with homework. It was giving others what she'd once desperately needed. Someone who believed in them, someone who saw their potential, someone who refused to let them be invisible. She was finding purpose beyond survival. And it felt extraordinary. 1 year after the discovery behind the library, Sophie, Grace, and Jonathan returned to that spot. Whitmore Academy had transformed it. Where there had once been overgrown bushes and a dirty service area, there was now a small garden. Flowers bloomed in carefully tended beds. A bench sat beneath a small tree, and mounted on the brick wall was a bronze plaque that read, "Where excellence meets compassion," in honor of the friendship that reminded us true education happens when we see each other. Grace sat on the bench, pulling Sophie down beside her. "This is where everything changed. This is where I stopped being invisible," Sophie agreed, running her fingers over the plaque. Jonathan stood before them, hands in his pockets, looking at the spot where he'd found his daughter sitting with a homeless girl. "This is where I learned what actually matters. Not money or status or success, but connection, compassion, being brave enough to help someone everyone else overlooks." "We were all invisible in our own ways," Grace said softly. "I was invisible to you, Dad. You were so busy with work you couldn't see me struggling. And Sophie was invisible to everyone because they refused to look past the poverty." "And now?" Jonathan asked. "Now we see each other," Sophie answered. "Really see each other. That makes all the difference." Sophie's 13th birthday fell on a Saturday in early November. She'd never had a real birthday party before. Sure, there'd been that cake with candles when she was young, back when her mother was well. But since then, birthdays had been just another day of survival. Not this year. The Whitmore mansion was decorated with streamers and balloons. Mrs. Chen had made a 3-tier cake. Jonathan had invited Sophie's classmates, even extending an olive branch to Madison, who surprisingly accepted and even brought a gift. But the most important guests were the ones who'd seen Sophie first. Mrs. Patterson arrived with her husband, who was walking now with just a cane. "Sophie dear, you look wonderful." Marilyn came, looking healthy and happy, wearing a new dress Jonathan had helped her pick out. She held Sophie close and whispered, "Happy birthday, my bright star. I'm so proud of you." Grace gave Sophie a leather-bound journal and a necklace with a small star pendant. "You'll always be my bright star," she said. "My sister." Jonathan's gift was an envelope. Inside was a letter of acceptance to a prestigious summer program at MIT for gifted students. "You earned this," he said. "Your teacher recommended you after seeing your math solutions." Sophie was crying too hard to speak. She just hugged him. When it came time to blow out the candles, everyone gathered around singing happy birthday. Sophie closed her eyes, the candles flickering before her, and tried to think of a wish. But what could she wish for? She had a home, a family, a future. Her mother was healing. She was thriving in school. She had friends, purpose, and people who loved her. She blew out the candles, making no wish at all. "What did you wish for?" Grace asked, grinning. Sophie smiled through her tears. "Nothing. I have everything I need." Epilogue, 2 years later. Sophie Brooks stood at her locker at Whitmore Academy, now 14 years old and in her sophomore year. The girl who'd once listened through windows was now president of the math club, co-founder of the tutoring program, and ranked first in her class. But more than that, she was happy. Her mother, Marilyn, lived in her own apartment now, working part-time at a bookstore and attending therapy regularly. She was healthy, stable, and back in Sophie's life in a meaningful way. They had dinner together every Sunday, making up for lost time. Jonathan had become the father Sophie never had. He taught her about business, took her to conferences, treated her exactly the same as Grace, because in every way that mattered, she was his daughter. Grace had blossomed into a confident, outspoken young woman. She still needed help with math sometimes, but she approached challenges now with determination instead of defeat. She and Sophie were inseparable, sisters in every sense but blood. The Sophie Brooks Scholarship Fund had helped 50 homeless students access education, housing, and mental health support. Sophie received letters from them regularly, telling her how much the scholarship meant, how it had changed their lives. Each letter reminded her of how far she'd come. From invisible to invaluable. From homeless to home. "Ready?" Grace asked, appearing beside her locker with her backpack. Sophie smiled, closing her locker door. Together, they walked through Whitmore's main gates, arms linked, heading home to the mansion that had once seemed like an impossible dream. "You know what I was thinking about?" Sophie said as they walked. "What?" "I used to think the world had no place for girls like me. That being poor meant being worthless. That intelligence didn't matter if you didn't have the right background. And now..." Sophie squeezed Grace's arm. "Now I know I was wrong. The world has plenty of place for people like me. I just needed someone to see me, to believe in me, to give me a chance to prove what I could do." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, past the spot behind the library where everything had changed. "You changed my life too, you know," Grace said softly. "Before you, I thought I was stupid, worthless, just the disappointing daughter of a brilliant father. You taught me I was so much more than that." "We saved each other," Sophie said simply. "Yeah, we did." As they reached the corner where Jonathan's car waited to drive them home, Sophie looked back at Whitmore Academy one more time. At the school that had once seemed so impossibly out of reach. At the place where she'd hidden in bushes and listened through windows, desperate for knowledge. Now she walked through the front door every day. Now she belonged. "Come on," Grace said, tugging her toward the car. "Mrs. Chin is making lasagna tonight." Sophie grinned. "Race you there." They ran toward the car, laughing, two sisters racing home to family, to warmth, to love. Behind them, the bronze plaque gleamed in the afternoon sun. "Where excellence meets compassion." And in that moment, Sophie understood the deepest truth of her journey. Sometimes the most powerful thing wealth can do is recognize worth where others see only worthlessness. Sometimes the best education happens outside of classrooms. And sometimes being seen, truly seen, for who you are is the greatest gift anyone can give.
Based on the truth that brilliance exists in unexpected places. And sometimes the people we help end up saving us too. Every child deserves to be seen. Every child deserves a chance. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere right now there's a Sophie, brilliant, overlooked, surviving, who just needs one person to see them. Be that person today. Don't forget to like, drop comments and subscribe if you want to see more interesting stories like this.